Ooh, nice. It has a chat feed directly on the Streamlabs software. That's very convenient.
Yeah, and it
Put by the way, put
is
the
open now.
Streamlabs link in the stream description.
Okay, I also put it in the chat.
Yeah, okay. I saw it in the chat. I'm just like, oh no.
Yeah, it's in the description as well. Hey, everybody
Oh,
who's watching right now.
wait a minute. Did you actually get it to go live?
Yeah, it's live.
Uh, oh, that was unexpected. Okay. I was expecting it to be another 5 minutes. I mean, it's not a problem or
Yeah, I was
anything.
just
It's just unexpected.
all right. Well, everybody can hear us talking right now. How are you all doing tonight? Got a lot to talk about. Don't really know how to begin presenting it, but we're getting things set up. Namely, there's going to be some gameplay footage.
Yep.
So,
I mean, I can just start that
what were you going to
whenever, but
say?
right now I'm kind of right now my mind's kind of drawn on something we were going to be talking about right before the stream started. We were chatting about topics. Like we had a main topic that we're going to be focusing on. That's most likely going to be the bulk of the stream, but there is
Yeah,
some.
how culture war narrative presently,
Yep. Mate.
and how the government is very blatantly contradicting one of the narratives that they created to propagandize people around that narrative on. But there's a lot to unpack even there, so I suppose we could just summarize what we're talking about to anybody who's listening.
That was a framing device. There was a video being shared around by Xander Hall, I believe that's how you pronounce it, called Trump Betrayed
Yeah.
MAGA and They're Pissed. We're not actually going to be watching that video or replying to it directly, but I'm just using that as a framing device because basically, here's a summary of events. Donald Trump made his campaign in 2016 and 2020 and 2024 on the basis of curbing down immigration into the United States on the basis of protecting American jobs and American labor from being overtaken by foreigners. And suddenly, just in the last like week or so, he's completely
Literally today.
not today actually. I've been seeing it. I've been seeing it for a few days now.
Ah, okay.
Might be the first you saw it, but yeah,
Yeah.
just in the last week, he's completely done a 180 on that. You can actually see multiple tweets by Elon Musk in particular, though I believe Vivek Ramaswamy has also made posts about it, talking about how we being the United States' white market requires foreigners in order to be able to fill labor positions. Basically doing a complete 180, talking about expanding the H-1B visa program so that more people who are going to be dependent on the United States government in order to be able to physically be present in the United States government without having some kind of involuntary interaction and completely shacking these people by forcing them into a position where both the United States government and their corporate proxies are going to have tremendous power over the workers, which is going to, of course, have the effect of depressing wages and diminishing the bargaining power of even domestic workers, which is just, again, I mean, you can't see my facial expression, but I can't help but physically scoff at the very obvious ploy that has become so readily apparent that everybody, both like everyone who is politicized has been able to pick up on it. Democrats, Republicans, they're finding a lot more common cause in just the last few weeks than what I've probably seen in the last few decades of my life. I mean,
Yeah.
I thought that like them coming together in response to the assassination of Brian Thompson, the former United Healthcare CEO, where like you can look at the comments section of the Ben Shapiro and what's his name, The unconfirmed kitty diddler. What's his name?
Matt Walsh.
Yeah, that one. Sorry, I have so much on my mind right now. Then honestly, I've always been terrible with names. So yeah, Matt
No, it's
Walsh. And yes, I am pretty sure. I don't have proof, no proof at all, but I am pretty sure Matt Walsh is a kitty diddler, and I am not ashamed to say that. But anyways, both of them posted content on the Daily Wire and Daily Wire YouTube channel trying to do apologetics for United Healthcare and United Healthcare CEO, talking about like how great and wonderful CEOs are, and the comment section is just filled with people who are just like, "You're wrong," and these are people who both claim to be Matt Walsh's and the Daily Wire's audience, as well as people who are obvious Marxoids because Marxoid Marxoid terminology like class consciousness is one particular standout example. And it's just like, yeah,
very
they're coming together because you suck.
Yeah, it's very clear that although they're coming to different understandings and they're representing internally, like what the reason the phenomenon they're observing is like happening and what it's being caused by, they have different explanations for it. But everyone is increasingly coming to identify what we could demonstrate is the effect of the organizational interests of the state in enforcing property titles and the influence that that has on the way that people behave and how they consequently coordinate. And this is the way that this is related to that specific notion is because this right here is a perfect example of everything that we've been trying to explain for the last couple of years, except this time we're pointing it out while everything is collapsing, and we're going to, we're providing a method of identifying what the state is, a methodology for identifying what it is, a method for coordinating against it, and also for what counts as direct action that can be directed towards subversive ends against it based on this. So that's one thing that we're coming. That's one thing that's going to be different about the back alley going forward. But before I get ahead of myself, uh, yeah, the point of bringing all of this up is I'm not here to try to give you guys that I told you so. Anyone who is currently invested in political ideologies or is going to be trying to double down on the notion that there's an objective perception, an objective narrative of reality, or an universal norm that societies have to be structured around to emerge. All of the assumptions peddled by the Socratic method. Now, what I want to point out to you is that this happened as a result of what the state was inherently incentivized to do. There was never going to be a mass deportation because of the fact that the state, if anything, needs more laborers right now because of the problems that it's facing internally.
We already saw, just like in the last several months, a lot. This was particularly prominent in conservative media, where they were whining endlessly about population decline. I mean, you would see rumblings about it in the years past. I remember even hearing it back when I was a conservatard. Like it wasn't like a big thing, but I remember people bringing it up every now and then, trying to point to places like South Korea, China, and Japan, their declining birth rates, and that was, oh, I can't remember what the exact narrative was because that was like over a decade ago. But uh, yeah, this is something that they are actually concerned about within their own internal reasoning. And it seems that that whole thing, and certainly within just the last few years and the last few months in particular, where I noticed it started ramping up, was specifically to try to construct this narrative of, oh, we actually need immigrants. In the meantime, you have a video of Donald Trump saying, no, 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 what are you talking about? I was never against reducing the H-1 visa program. What are you talking about? You're crazy.
But what this is revealing to a lot of people and why they're coming to the conclusion the conclusions that I was describing, or at least they're identifying the effects of it, is because in practice, the norms of behavior that people have to adopt simply in order to survive are causing them to realize that political ideologies can't actually reflect a sense of reality that can exist outside of their own imaginations. It just demonstrably represents the state in like as an almost supernatural construct. It Political ideologies treat the state as essentially just an abstract representation of the concept of power. They treat the state as though its role in society is what causes norms to exist and what quote unquote directs morality and behavior.
Hmm.
So like that's the reason that's often cited to anarchists by proponents of political ideology, ironically enough, for what a problem that would supposedly emerge if states don't exist. What if someone simply dictates the norms that they want in their behavior based on their own sense of morality? They're not reflecting on the actual internal psychology that drives one to act or the practical implications of one performing an action from an economic perspective. They're talking about behavior as though it just exists in a vacuum, and they're talking about the state like it's an abstract concept.
Hold on a second. We got someone in the chat asking, when are we gonna start uploading videos again? So, at least from my own personal experience, you might have noticed that we actually posted two videos in, oh, when was that? Like late November, early December.
It was the end of October.
Oh man, time flew by. Anyways, so so what happened is that my own personal experience when making my own video was that it was very difficult to write because my own understanding of the concepts that I was writing was constantly evolving as new information came about. And this isn't like the first time I've had this either. There were videos that I intended that I probably only talked about in Discord, but didn't really. You guys wouldn't have known about it, so you probably wouldn't have known at the time. But the idea was that I wanted to make a video, and then as I evolved my own understanding of the concept, the video itself had to change to accommodate that. So, for example, myself and Douglas, who you all might not be familiar with, but he's basically part of a trio of us. He was actually in one of our videos, but he only appeared in the one. That's not to say like he's not welcome in any other videos. He's more than welcome, but he doesn't really. He's shy, basically. But anyway, so I'm just bringing it up to point out that. Let me actually give you a specific example of the video we wanted to write. It was about open source technology, and specifically in relation to the topic of licensing and the best way to, for any kind of open source tech, software, whatever, to license itself would be. Unfortunately, the fact that licensing exists means that if it's not licensed, some billionaire or aspiring billionaire will just take your software, put a patent on it, and then resell it, which is basically how Billy Gates was able to get Microsoft going. So, in order to prevent that, unfortunately, you need a license. However, the best way to subvert that option, because we do not like licensing as a concept, is to develop a license which is designed specifically to get the software to be as open and available for as many people as humanly possible. And that was what the video is
But
going to be about. However, as we went more and more into the video, we realized that licensing was only the tip of the iceberg, and we ended up having to go into what counts as open source, what does that mean, and that led to a bunch of having to go into a bunch of other stuff and a bunch of other stuff. And the point is that the topic of the video ended up continually and rapidly expanding. to the point where we ended up, at some point during the writing of the video, we ended up dropping the licensing concept entirely because we were attempting to figure out solutions that would subvert the need for having, say, I'm not actually suggesting people use copyleft. I'm just citing it as an example, but citing copyleft as, or that would subvert the need for copyleft as a concept entirely. And for those of you who aren't familiar, copyleft is an attempt to create an open source, freely available copyright system that would be open and available for anyone to use or modify without cost as they see fit.
And the story of Esso, that video was the most hellish thing that I've ever written in my entire life and made. Like, as far as from a mental perspective, how stressful it was to actually articulate a lot of that. And just the notion of using my own traumas as a framing device, that's it being put in a position where I have to do that. That is it's difficult to describe what that felt like, but getting it done and understanding the implications of finishing it, what it would have in allowing me to represent some of the things that I'd learned along the way in a perspective where it could be emulated by other people because it's simply a representation of how that perspective developed from a cognitive point of view. Um, it's a demonstration of many of the concepts that I was explaining in that video in and of itself, which is the reason why I chose to do that, coupled with some of the like audio visual effects that I'd used, which was again intended to both create like a sense of aesthetic, but also to demonstrate in practice that what I was claiming about the nature of perception and some of the context about how it works is accurate from a technical perspective that can't be disputed.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just bringing it up to demonstrate that, like, I'm just going to say this right now, like, some of our 2017, 2018 content, uh, mentally, we can't go back to that. Not because it's, like, physically impossible or anything. I'm not suggesting any kind of not suggesting any kind of, like, thing that it can't be done. But it's just that mentally, we're not at that point anymore. We're well past that. Put simply, the discussion is over, and any attempt to try to convince people by making reply videos, commentary, or even attempting to explain certain concepts is, well, it's difficult for us to say the least. And honestly, like, yeah, making it, like, even in like 2018 and a little bit into early 2019, when I was petering off of the reply content and just general commentary, I felt the sense that I was making the same video over and over again, and that I did not want to do. I wanted to feel like
Yeah,
I
I
was
was
making something unique, at least every time I attempted to put out a video. And it's also kind of why the why X sci-fi civilization is doomed to fail kind of petered out, because again I was kind of making the same points over and over again. And hell, even like that series was predated by some video replying, I can't remember its title, talking about why I thought UFOs, or why I thought, what was it? Why I thought space aliens would be anarchists. Which I still think that a lot of the points I brought up are valid, even if they are poorly worded compared to the concepts as I understand them today. But yeah, the point is that the main, not really a problem, but the main feature, I should say, regarding why we've been doing what we've been doing, even if people have been claiming an absence, is because our content and our understanding of how to share it, how to present it, etc., is in a constant state of evolution, and that evolution has outpaced our ability to actually put stuff out.
Well, right now we're at the point where we're going to be making a lot of videos in the near future explaining a lot of the things that we need to discuss with people. But that leads me nicely into the second point that I was going to discuss, which has made a lot of people realize that something is up, is also something that I highlighted in the story of Esso, which is how the platforms of social media sites and the way that apps are designed are very blatantly using brainwashing tactics to manipulate how everyone's perception is being informed. And people have caught on to the fact that this is happening, but don't understand it from the perspective of what its nature is.
And right
And
right now we have Weston asking, we've transcended the concept of engaging with normal people. And yeah, I see stuff flying by in the chat. Uh, that's why we can't respond to all of it because a lot of these points are very complex and require us talking about a lot of stuff. So yes, I see a lot more recent posts, and unfortunately, it's unlikely we'll be able to answer all of them. So for that, I do apologize. But no, we haven't quote unquote transcended talking to quote unquote normal people. I like to think I talk to normal people all the time, and nor do I think that a lot of these concepts are too highbrow or whatever for normal people, whatever that means to understand. Quite frankly, I see a great benefit to having as many people understand this as possible. The trouble is that in
yeah,
order to convey this information, it requires undoing a absolutely tremendous amount of propaganda, not just in terms of specific points of information that people understand it, but the means by which information itself is contextualized to you personally itself is dictated by propaganda that you yourself probably aren't even aware of because you don't think of it as propaganda.
yeah, when you go down the rabbit hole of your own beliefs after you understand how perception works from a cognitive point of view, you will be surprised at how many things you believe that you did not rationally control coming to that conclusion of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so don't worry. These are not bad questions. They're quite frankly, I think they're fair questions to ask. And if we don't have an answer for them, well, then that's on us. I'm just pointing out that I was actually choosing that question specifically because I thought it was worth addressing. So yeah, don't feel the need to apologize. But yeah, don't worry. We'd be happy to deprogram you. But in fact, that's actually part of the reason why we wanted to do this stream in the first place, to give people who are interested in our content the ability to be able to have a point of reference outside of the narrow scope of how information is processed that is given to you through government indoctrination. And of course, when I mean government indoctrination, this is one of the things that's actually really important. It's not just government schools. Government schools are important, but it's also the people who are also trained by government schools, who are your peers, your parents, your coworkers, your bosses, etc., who are all going to be reinforcing the exact same propaganda models to you completely unwittingly.
Now, how the applications and how the proprietary media infrastructure influences this functions. So, thinking, keep in mind that keep in mind the point that I had noted earlier about cognition not actually just being something that exists in a vacuum, but being gamed by your brain as a structure and how it works physically as a mechanism, and then understand that the process through which you create meaning is actually the software side of the brain's hardware, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the way that neuron pathways emerge, there's literally a process physically where the information that you perceive is going to influence the reaction that's chemically created, that then influences the information that the neurons encode into the brain.
Now
So
here's
what you have to so
uh,
what you have to understand essentially is that all meaning is not only something that your brain is creating, but that by creating it, that subtly influences the way that your brain then goes on to inform later perceptions.
Now, Weston actually has a good follow-up point. So, I'm just reading it aloud here. So, not only is it too complex to break down, I'm also so deeply ingrained in the context of my own ideas that you can't even start.
No, it's just something that can't be explained in propositions because it's explicitly refuting the notion that you can base meaning on self-referential concepts like a proposition. You have to explain if you're going to represent how a construct works to someone that has assumptions about the nature of logic that's manipulating the way that they process cause and effect. You have to do this through narrative rules because actually the brain processes every single statement's beginning and end in the context of narrative rules. So when you understand the way the brain processes aesthetic, you can use aesthetic to create meaning outside of the metaphysical nature of the concepts you're representing because you can describe concepts in relation to one another in such a way where by implication of the characteristics ascribed to them it causes a reaction by perceiving it physically that the narrative that the statement represents is intended to cause as a repeatable reaction. This is all possible and can be studied from the neurological framework. Well, it's all possible to observe, I mean.
And no,
It's
Weston, it's
just
not it's not it's not impossible because neuroplasticity exists. Granted, you probably might not be
yeah,
familiar with how neuroplastic or what neuroplasticity is, but or how it functions. But put simply, your brain, the neuron connections in your brain change according to stimuli that you experience within your environment. Just simply seeing a thing, a phenomena, or even a phenomena not changing at all causes your brain, the structure of your brain to physically change. So that same exact process also alters how you interact with certain information, narratives, people, how you think about them, etc. Your brain is not a static thing like in the same way that a computer might be. Although a brain is analogous to a computer, it's significantly more dynamic.
yeah. The main difference is that the physical structure is constantly changing because the neurons are creating an effect where it can represent fractals like consciousness.
Mm-hmm. So, uh,
That's the main concept that our approach to understanding psychology is informed by. You could summarize it as representing perception from the perspective of its genesis, how that works in the brain, as opposed to trying to represent psychology in the context of psychiatry, which is what it's currently based on. Which there's a lot to unpack just there, but yeah, there's a lot of context to go over.
yeah. So, anyways, back to where we should go back to what we were talking about previously, particularly in regards to Donald Trump and him unwittingly proving our point about the state and how it functions. I mean, I guess one could call it how it functions, but it is just it is basically just the state performing the functions that we expected it to. Where,
Well, my,
sorry,
uh, what were you saying? I didn't mean to interrupt.
yeah, I was just pointing out that the state doing that bait and switch with the H-1B visa is exactly what they're talking about. That it doesn't matter like how popular or unpopular an issue is, whether a particular candidate who champions this particular perspective on an issue is popular or not. What the state actually does and what it intends to do is completely independent of the popularity of any given policy proposal or lack thereof. They were always going to do this anyway, and all that really happened is that they were able to get a lot of people emotionally invested into one particular narrative or another, and now that one particular side won, that one on one particular perspective on the narrative, this means that now they have to gaslight people about that narrative. It's just like, no, what are you talking about? We were always at war with Oceania. We were at war. We're actually at war with East Asia. We've always been at war with East Asia. No, no, no. What are you talking about? East Asia has always been our greatest ally. Give it like,
Well,
give
and
it like a few weeks. No, I'm making this as a joke, by the way, not literally. But Israel will always have turned out to be America's worst enemy.
no, I doubt that.
I doubt it
The
too.
Israeli government.
I doubt that too, but I'm just listing it as an example of if for some unexplained reason the Israeli government's presence in the Middle East became a liability to the United States' political interests, then the United States would definitely gaslight people about how Israel was always America's worst enemy, and suddenly you would be hearing all this stuff about the Palestinian genocide, the Nakba, and oh, what was it called? The USS Liberty incident. Suddenly that would be
Yeah, and if you
everywhere.
want Yeah, and if you want the most glaring example of the U.S. government behaving in that way, the fact that they started backing the Khmer Rouge financially in the 1980s, I think, is probably the strongest indication of it's the best example in practice of states engaging in behavior based on how we've been portraying the basis of their incentives, which is think about them as models of organization and understand that as models of organization, the entire business cycle that they operate internally around only can exist if they're defending property titles. So governments are organizations that are gamed around defending property titles for the sake of just continuing to defend property titles because financially they require doing that in order to keep the entire loop going. So they do not care fundamentally about any moral ideologies or any pretext that they pretend to give other than the cost benefit analysis that would be consistent with the problems that their organization is facing internally relative to the other states that would be involved in whatever dispute you're studying.
Sorry, I'm just. Weston has now said there is so much obviously wrong with what you, presumably USO, said that he cannot begin to unspool it, at least not in this live stream. Which I mean, fair enough. In this chat, there's hardly enough room in like what is it, 255 characters, for you to be able to unpack like literally everything that was discussed. But we have in
Oh, I'm
this.
expecting.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm expecting a lot. I'm expecting a lot of the stuff that we come back with to be incredibly controversial because of how many sacred cows it's going to cook.
Oh my goodness! Like we're not just cooking. We're not just cooking a few sacred cows. Like we're burning down the entire freaking ranch. Big, free filet mignon for everybody. That's what's going on here.
Yeah, everybody wanted to grill. Well, they probably didn't expect that this was going to be how it happened.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I don't know about you, but I mean, I'm actually pretty confident about you. But I'm chill. I'm fine with all of the sacred cows burning. Quite frankly, I
Yeah.
think I found that the idea of a sacred cow to be rather silly for a rather long amount of time, or at least that's how I think about it. Although I could be wrong.
I want to turn iconoclasm into an ascetic practice because of the effect that creating any sort of pride invested in something external to yourself has on your psyche.
Actually, I think that's been around for a while. It's just kind of fallen out of favor ever since like the ever since YouTube atheism kind of petered off. Back then, it was kind of the cool thing to do, but now it was always directed at something that was, well, not exactly productive. It was kind of just people trying to piss off Christians. Then it became people trying to
No, I
piss
don't.
off Muslims, and yeah.
Yeah, they weren't engaging in acts of iconoclasm. They were just saying, "Religion's not my dad," and yelling about it. I mean, they would throw paint on a monument or something. No, I straight up mean like crucifixes in the environment. If you understand the history behind the intellectual development of Judeo-Christianity, oh yeah,
Oh
that's one
God,
of the things we're talking a lot about.
that's one of the
But
things that's gonna be 200 characters. Okay, that's gonna be one of the rabbit holes that we're gonna want to explore in future content. And oh my goodness. And yeah, I do think that sacred cow is a fairly accurate term to describe it because, I mean, let's be honest, most of the people who subscribe to all of these beliefs in politics do so through dogmatic reasoning, motivated almost exclusively through their own egos. So yeah,
yeah, that
they
that
hold
right
they
there.
hold they hold on to it
Right.
for the exact same reason that a religious person might hold on to their beliefs because they have a set of rules that are dictated to them by their egos that they simply cannot stand the idea of letting go of for one reason or another. Actually, I know the reason already. It's because they physically view their literal survival on it.
It's not something that exists in their conscious perception. It's the reason that creating any self-existent perceptions or references, perceptions that are based on self-references. So a proposition in logic, for example, or the perception of something existing objectively would be another. The problem that well, what this represented from the physical perspective of your brain is it's a series of neurons that have created a physical structure that your brain is dependent on maintaining in order to maintain the perception of itself because it only exists inside of your brain. It's not actually a representation of something that can exist independently from it because it's not based on a repeatable pattern that exists outside of your own already existing narrative of reality.
And we already know.
So,
We sorry.
what I was going to say is so if your narrative of reality becomes dependent on this physical structure being maintained in order for your brain to be able to reference it, that means that your brain is physically dependent on maintaining the self reference, which is the reason why people go into cognitive dissonance trying to defend it.
You can see this in action physically, like not just in terms of like I'm trying to figure out the best way to phrase this. So we've seen this in action, and it's pretty uncontroversial actually, where people who perceive themselves being challenged in regards to their political beliefs, and this was I'm sure there are other studies done on other ways this manifested, but I'm just recalling the one that studied like politically held beliefs, where they showed like Democrats or people who identified as Democrats information sourced from quote unquote Republican sources like the Daily Wire or Fox News, and they showed the inverse like they showed Republicans information from CNN or MSNBC, and when they found their beliefs to be challenged, it provoked in them the same physical and hormonal responses from their brain as though they were under physical assault.
Yeah, I referenced that study in the story of Esso.
I just figure it's worth referencing again here to demonstrate that yes, this not only happens, but not we, but it's been physically observed happening in human brains. So what we're describing here shouldn't even be controversial. And the fact that some might even find it controversial is a demonstration of actually what we're talking about in terms of how eagerly people are willing to hold on to their own sacred cows.
Yeah, because the concept that I was explaining about the organizational incentives of the state and what it is as a concept, that's literally just expanding the premise of follow the money to the nature of the state itself, rather than any organizations that exist or are operating within the logic of the political economy. Hey, what maintains this political economy to begin with? It's just that notion. And the fact that that is so hard for people to do, it's not that it's not that people find it difficult that's led us to just assume that this is the product of brainwashing. No, I mean we're going to be going into a lot of detail when we make our content expanding upon this in the future. But no, we can show based on the logic of replies defending ideological perspectives simply in the way that concepts are described in relation to one another, that people that are doubling down and defending political ideologies have a narrative of reality that's just disconnected from anything that can be put into practice because it can only exist in their imaginations.
I see. Yeah, you're clear. I can tell you're clearly bothering people because I'm seeing a lot of I'm seeing a lot of people trying to say source. Source to what?
Um, yeah, which specific claim? We cited every single one of the claims that we just made about cognition, though I directly cited in my video, and I think you probably cited in yours.
Hmm. So I mean, like, do you want a source to the stuff about how people are, uh, how people or feel defensive and feel like they're under physical assault when their political beliefs are challenged, and they start to develop a defensive response? Is that the thing you want a source to? I'm not trying to be facetious. I actually want to know.
But here's an interesting question, and this is something that you can ask yourself in regards to your own assumptions about logic. Why is it valid or invalid to provide a source in response to the claims that we're making based on the fact that we're also in the process of making the claim, just explaining how it works and providing a repeatable method? Like, sure, it would probably be more helpful and a bit easier to swallow to have, I guess, a different study representing context that could only emerge if what we're describing is accurate. So, from like the context of a different field, this is also like this can also be seen. But as far as what we're describing with cognition, I mean, fuck, just think about what you're perceiving right now and how it works.
I can't help but feel like some people's actions and how they're describing things has changed from the beginning of the stream to its present moment is a proper demonstration just simply because the sacred cows have been challenged. I can't look up the source right now because you can see on the stream I'm playing Super Animal Royale. Maybe SO you might have a chance or someone in the chat could probably dig it up. But yeah, uh,
Yeah, I'm
and if
not
it helps,
really.
but I'll tell you this with absolute with I maybe not with absolute certainty, but I have a high degree of confidence when I say that I have zero expectation that even if we had a credited peer-reviewed source that demonstrated everything that I was talking about completely, that he still wouldn't be satisfied.
There would be a problem with the publication that it was submitted to, or there would be a problem with one of the people that peer reviewed it, quote unquote.
Hmm. Oh, that was a source or this study was published by Professor Alexander Dravensky, and they once spoke at a Russian university. Therefore, they work for the KGB. I don't know if that's actually what would happen, but I mean, I've seen that response like
Former
dozens and dozens of times just in my own life. So from my own experience, I can't help but feel like that's a fairly accurate characterization of
but
exactly that phenomenon.
Yuri Bezmenov is based in his description of how propaganda works can definitely be trusted because he's a former KGB agent that became a CIA agent, and while he gave that lecture, he was employed for the CIA working as a disinfo agent, hence why the name listed in that study was not Yuri Bezmenov. It's because he was currently sheep dipped when he gave that.
And yeah,
Sheep dip, by the way, is euphemism used in intelligence agencies for giving someone a fake legal identity and trying to pass them off as an alter ego.
yeah. Anyways, Tater Tat asks me, "What's my opinion on Catholicism now after going in a more egoist direction in the last 6 years, heretic? Since you professed faith in a few of your older videos, I've long since moved away from Catholicism for reasons that I think I've alluded to in older streams. Definitely haven't made a video about it, so I can understand that there's a lot of confusion around that. However, suffice to say, like not only are there like a crap ton of institutional problems within the Catholic Church, but the very idea of Catholicism and just modern sects of Christianity in general, not just Catholicism, but also Protestantism and those various other forms of trying to understand that particular practice of spirituality is completely corrupted. And I'm perfectly comfortable using that term because the practice was originally derived from the Valentinian sect of Gnosticism as a practice for directing one's focus and, meditating towards cultivating a greater understanding of the self and the relationship to their environment, which has since been corrupted through Kabbalist mysticism to be useful to the Roman Empire as a form of propaganda.
Yeah, one of
That
the
is a
biggest
gigantic rabbit hole that we are totally going to get down, and there's nothing you can do to stop us.
Yeah, one of the biggest, and by the way, we don't have to like we have evidence outside of just the narrative of the Bible itself to support this. Like the historical sources of a lot of these documents, as well as documented evidence of purges carried out by the Roman Empire, coincidentally lining up with developments in the Coptic Church of Egypt and also the church that was established in Greece. So, yeah, we're going to be probably creating a series starting this year, going down that rabbit hole. But one of the biggest sacred cows that I know, and because of what it's going to, what we've already what we've already found going down this rabbit hole. Um, yeah, this is going to be one of the biggest sacred cows. That the Gnostic narrative of the Bible is accurate, and Judeo Christianity is a subversion, perpetuated by the Roman Empire in collaboration with a tribe from the Semitic tribe, specifically the House of David. The House of David created a system of mysticism that was designed specifically to create a type of psychological state that was constantly um, in a reactive emotional, basically their full right hemisphere, no left hemisphere, so they can be emotionally manipulated and they have a difficult time critically examining their own reasoning because they don't know how to identify the difference in the function between their left and right hemispheres as a result of creating the psychological constructs that are represented by the system of mysticism the tribe of David developed.
All right, here's an interesting comment that came up from Backalley Abortion. Guys, just admit in the past you did wrong, you messed up, and in the future you'll do better. It'd be gravy, and I think you mean no one, would give you a hard time over your past. Saying it never occurred wouldn't work. Uh,
Yeah, and I just removed that because that's Mr. Dapperton on a troll account. That's Mr. Dapperton on a troll account.
I actually wanted to address that because one, we're not going to be denying our past. In fact, that was originally a topic for this. That was originally what we wanted to talk about in the stream. But as I'm sure you're aware, plans change a lot, which is fine. Nothing wrong with it. Two, we're
Yeah,
perfectly
what I
happy. We're
did is,
perfectly happy to admit we're wrong, and I've even had. There's even several instances in this video, or not this video, sorry, this stream, where we did exactly that, where we disavowed a lot of the beliefs that we previously held. Like I mentioned previously that I was a conservatard. Obviously, I was incorrect about a lot of the assumptions and propositions that I presented at that time in my life. However, I'm also not necessarily ashamed of them because those experiences made me the kind of person that I am today. And third, I know for absolute certainty, and I am willing to say certainty here, that even if we did everything you asked, your ego would not allow you to just simply leave alone.
yeah, I just wanted to, yeah, I wanted to state for the record, I kind of left open-ended my response to the whole situation, namely because I was giving you a genuine opportunity for self-reflection and reserving my judgment. I mean, like I said, I knew this was in the video, the story of Esso. I knew that you were going to continue doubling down because I understand the rules of how narcissistic egos work. But yeah, this is pretty pathetic. Your response to the whole situation, like even for you, like I am legitimately shocked that I was like you unironically gang stalked me for 5 to 6 years and just constantly did this for the attempt of like with the intent of trying to slander me. And then there's all the other stuff that fucking like Jim did. It's your behavior is unhinged, and your response to it is to start playing the fucking is to start basically accusing Jeremiah Harding of what you did to me because he's giving you shit about your poorly programmed game. Like that's what Dapperton turned around and did to everybody who hasn't been keeping up or didn't, doesn't know. Is what I accused him of in the story of Esso. He turned around and made a video saying that that's what Jeremiah Harding was doing to him.
Sounds about right. Oh, and by the way, Dapperton, from one person who developed a game to another person who developed a game, I would strongly recommend that you switch from a triple jump to a double jump and make the double jumps more controlled. The hitboxes on the heads of the enemies are very difficult to gauge and are very inconsistent, making it very difficult to chain jump. The coins should be much fewer and farther between, but should be able to pierce multiple enemies. It would certainly make them more useful as an item. And four, can you please get rid of the homing poop thing? That is by far the most obnoxious thing to have to deal with as an enemy, because if you jump on that and you jump wrong, like you're screwed. Like projectile enemies are fine, but maybe the projectile should be limited to specifically going horizontal. I don't know, I'm just offering some constructive criticism there. The game itself is not doomed to fail, but I think you could do with some adjustments to some of the core mechanics that could actually elevate the game to something truly special.
But yeah, now we're not telling you to fade to dust because it's an insult that's directed to get under your skin. We're telling you to fade to dust because that's what's happened to you as a result of doubling down.
I mean, fade to dust is kind of it's meant to be directed past tense, not present tense.
Yeah, but I love what tends to happen when people continue doubling down with their ego, and it's not like a tendency. You can explain why this happens. It's because egos are based on the reason they operate internally around the assumption that their own internal perception of threats that they've identified that they have to try to for exist and are an actual practical problem, but they usually are just hallucinations caused by them projecting their own assumptions onto the environment. And as a result of trying to adapt to that, that usually puts narcissists in a position where they end up causing the exact thing that they didn't want to happen to end up occurring. And this is a perfect example of that.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I gave my constructive criticisms, or yeah, my constructive criticism specifically for myself. I don't even know if Mr. Tapperton's still listening to the stream right now, and I really don't think he is. I think he just wanted to say what he did and then just jumped off immediately. But I figured that I can say that I gave my constructive criticism because I don't know. I just wanted to, as you might have as you might have been able to tell, I actually did play the game, and it's not good. Is all I'll say. I don't know. Maybe somebody enjoyed it, but all I can say
He's just
about
going to
Mister
turn into a. Sorry.
all I'm gonna say is, Mr. Dapperton, you can look at our content and the things we were saying and how we were saying it then versus how we are, how we think, and how we talk now, and compare and contrast them. There is a very clear gradient of how we've changed both as people and as philosophers. And I don't think you've changed at all since I've known you.
I mean, if he has, it's for the worst. I mean, I'm not trying to. I just wanted to go on about this for a bit because you felt like bringing it up, but also because, yeah, I usually shy away from talking about this drama. I don't really give a fuck anymore, but I'm just going to be stating this here in order to elaborate on my perspective. Like I still just want I still am at the point where I feel as though there's no conflict while the state continues existing that matters more than getting the state out of the environment at this point, especially now that they've just technically designed the communication infrastructure to brainwash people in how it filters content information into people.
Okay,
Like that people need to really start taking that more seriously because that's a fucking humanity ending threat.
Neuroposter just said, quote unquote, as philosophers. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and correct myself there. Philosopher is an archetype, and we want to move away from archetype as much as possible. So let me rephrase that to be people who performed the function of philosophers.
I love he was probably setting up a situation where he was going to try to flex with his degree. Look, the state gave me a piece of paper. I am a scientist. I am a scientist.
Yes, but in turn, I turned his setup into my setup. Sorry, I felt
Yep.
like doing that.
But I don't know. I suppose we could talk about the intellectual develop. We could start talking about directly the intellectual development of FNET. Now that we've gotten all that out of the way.
Yep.
Basically, yeah. If you're disappointed about the state just continuing business as usual and you don't understand what to do about it, don't double down on politics because not only is that not going to be viable anymore, but the state is actively planning some pretty ominous things. And because of the way that norms in the environment now currently emerge, because of simply how technique has been expressed, it means that in order for consciousness to continue existing in people, people have to make themselves self sufficient from the white market in practice. It's the only way. You have to change the way that you inform your behavior so that these pressures aren't the state isn't able to exert leverage over you through these financial pressures.
Yep, which is some of the things that we discovered over the course of the evolution of the FNET project.
Yeah, in trying to organize in person and do networking, we learned a lot, not just in our studies, but in practice of trying to coordinate outside trying to coordinate outside of the context of the white market.
Mm-hmm.
In
What,
practice, we learned quite a few things that aren't really discussed in anarchist libertarian circles that have been instrumental in developing the method that we've concluded with.
sounds about right. I was just thinking in my own mind that I think it's going to be helpful to contextualize a lot of how this evolution came about. So, for those of you who might not recall everything that happened or even just new here, if you're new here, welcome. But for those of you who don't know, FNET originally began in August of 2018. Basically, when right around the time Cody Wilson started Defense Distributed, which basically completely subverted the ability for the state to exercise and enforce gun control, since literally anyone can now be not only their own gun manufacturer but also their gun designer, which completely makes it impossible for proprietary organizations to have control over what counts as a gun. Now people can just like get a hunk of plastic together and it shoots bullets. I mean, this already happened with like I mentioned Brian Thompson earlier in the stream, but yeah, allegedly he was killed by a he was killed with a 3D printed gun. I'm saying allegedly. Normally I wouldn't care about that kind of stuff, but there's a lot of circumstances surrounding the arrest of Luigi Mangione as the shooter that I still find to be kind of iffy, which makes me question whether or not he actually is the guy. But I'm not going to get into that in this stream. But anyways, yeah, I was just pointing that out because that was an inspiration for me in August of 2018 to point out, hey, wait a minute, this completely subverts the ability for the state to enforce gun control. What if we had something similar for the internet that completely subverted the ability for the state to enforce censorship? And that's basically where it began. And so our initial idea when we got around to developing the project further and fleshing it out was to basically just set up an improvement on how mesh networks normally operate. Because the big problem with mesh networks is that one, you need physical devices, and two, they had problems with scaling where up to a certain point, or once you got past a certain point rather, mesh networks began to fall apart in terms of their efficiency as the networking and technical processes required for them to continue to develop and to continue to maintain the networks become more intensive than what the network is actually capable of hosting. So it kind of like trails off, and we wanted to try to solve that. That is what I would characterize as like FNET 1.0. The one that more people in our audience is probably more familiar with is what I would characterize as FNET 2.0, and it kind of evolved from that. Like once we realized that, hey, wait a minute, the mesh network project doesn't go nearly far enough. So what we need to do is we need to figure out the way by which software itself, which was one of the major underlying problems that we would run into, is able to be fixed. And we ended up networking with a bunch of people to try to develop something that we would come to call the code shredder, which I'm not going to go into what it does or what it's supposed to do, but suffice to say, it would have been quite subversive in terms of the ability to network around the state's ability to not only control people's communications, but also give people more ability to control their own data on their own devices. It would also theoretically allow people to be able to turn their own devices into a mesh router, into their own Wi-Fi router. It's very
And
complicated, and
while
admittedly, a lot of the technical details are lost on me, especially given since it's been years since we've had discussions around how the code shredder was supposed to work. So forgive me if I'm either omitting a great amount of detail or outright misrepresenting it entirely. But yeah, and for reasons that I'm not going to get into, it was discovered that even having something that can turn any piece of software, shred it, and then spit out its source code, and then release the source code as open source, basically the ability to turn anything, any piece of software, including computer viruses, into open source software at any time, and anyone could just do that, didn't go far enough. Because as it turns out, the hardware is also the problem. The hardware is
Yeah, no,
broken for reasons that
yeah,
would require basically I'm not saying actually get a computer science degree, but I'm just trying to use that as an analogy for what level of understanding is required just to be able to understand what the actual problem is. And you want to know something even worse? Going into hardware isn't going far enough. We have to go into the human brain to be able to describe what's wrong with the internet.
because what we discovered that led us down the rabbit hole of trying to take this approach to the design of the hardware itself was that basically we were running into a problem, a paradox in math in a function that we were attempting to program, and the paradox represented in the context of math is known as Russell's paradox. Basically, it's a problem in the context of representing sets where, because a set in the context of the formula itself doesn't actually mean anything other than just blank proposition, you can't actually convey anything by simply referring to a formula in its own reasoning to describe what a set is. So it's usually the question is usually presented as, does a set which contains all sets contain itself? And what we realized in the context of the function that we were attempting to that was attempting to be programmed, we realized what the issue was because we could compare it to the design of the application that we were attempting to write. And what we realized led us to the conclusion that the hardware of computers was subtly manipulating what the computer was able to reference for what it was considering to be a set within the context of any given program.
Can we see a single? Someone is asking, can we see a single line of code? We can send you a whole hex sheet if you want. It's an older version, but yeah, we have them. I'm not gonna
Yeah,
give it
there's
to
a
you
lot
right.
of
We can't give it. I can't give it to you right now. Not because I don't want to, but because you can literally see that I'm playing Super Animal Royale right now. But I mean, I'm just saying that I totally could, and it's a significantly older version of the editor, so it's not like I would be giving you any kind of compromising information.
Yeah, we kind of had a brief fallout with the main person that we were working with that was developing it, but we recently got back into contact, so we'll probably be talking more about that actually in the near future.
Hmm. And for the record, he is still working on it. I have not mentioned it at all, even on Discord, because I'm going to be honest, I really had no idea if it was safe to talk about that or not. Actually, I probably should have asked. I probably should have asked about that a couple days ago, but I mean, it's been mentioned now, so you can't put that genie back in the bottle.
Well, first of all, I am just sick to death of walking around, walking on eggshells around a lot of the topics that we've actually been studying because of it being sensitive, and that's one of the things that I'm happiest about in being done with developing the method is we don't have to do that anymore because of the fact it's simply complete.
Yeah,
But
Weston, the code shredder's being written in opcodes, x86 opcodes. So yes, it would be a hex sheet. That might not be the technical term for it, but I would literally be giving you hex code.
yeah, in the last incarnation of it, it was being written directly in assembly.
Yep. I think it's still been being written in assembly. In its current form, it's functionally a hex editor.
But yeah, that we didn't give up on that because, or we didn't even necessarily give up on that, quote unquote, but we didn't deprioritize that just because of the falling out. We realized something as a result of developments in AIs that have come out in just the last 2 years that, well, led us to the rabbit hole that we kind of started by laying out and went into greater detail about in the story of Essa, which is that brains and computers have analogous rules as systems. And this was demonstrated by the fact that you can use information being encoded by neurons into the brain to train algorithms in neural nets.
Hmm.
It means that the way that that process works functionally from the perspective of the brain is analogous to how neural nets procedurally generate information.
Hmm. In our conversation with our programmer, and I'm going to refrain from referring to even usernames for purposes of his current living situation, is that he's more up to speed of the current state of the project, and he's still working on it. It's still important. However, uh, it's basically a component now rather than the core project. I think is the best way to put it. It's a very valuable component and something that we obviously can't do without. But it's kind of segmented in the same way the brain is comprised of multiple individual components.
I didn't have anything to add.
Yeah, so I was just bringing it up that that's the current state of the project. Like, is it safe? Like, would it be okay for me to name drop the current name that we're using internally for the project, or at least this
Sure.
other component of the project? Uh, we're working. One of the things that we're working on, and actually, someone in the comment was talking about this earlier today, in the comments, and I'm actually glad they brought that up because it's something that we realized too when we were originally we were just bringing up FNET. Rachel, you were the one that brought it up. All of the components for all the things that we wanted to do to break out of censorship as a concept already exist. It's just a matter of linking them together. It's what we're referring to as Project Fork the Internet. It's still in its early stages, but we've already identified several promising components that, if assembled together, should allow people to be able to have a complete and holistic internet experience without any of the proprietary nonsense that ordinarily is entailed by, government or by government nonsense. And you know for a fact that censorship is going to be a significantly greater component of the mainstream internet experience, especially as time goes on.
Neuroposter mentions because neural nets are designed based on neuron pathways. Yes, but if they didn't have analogous functional rules, how would you be able to use equipment sensing the information being encoded into the brain and then directly translating that into how an algorithm is representing content? I mean, creating information.
No, and Sergora, no, I'm not going to use an initial because that's still information.
It means that the hardware has comparable rules too.
Hmm. I mean, people who know already know the name of the person I'm talking about, but I'm not going to name drop it on a stream for obvious reasons. Sorry. Uh,
Just taking a sip for a second. But yeah, so that's I guess the approach to designing hardware, the side of that, and how intellectually the thought process roughly developed there. But from an intellectual perspective, it was primarily um, we were driven in that direction of trying to expand upon libertarianism as a methodology for describing action, as opposed to thinking about the concepts associated with it as ideological constructs, in part because of the inspiration of Cody Wilson, but also because of the influence of Sam McConkin's writings, which, from what I've come to understand about the last few years, Hoppians have taken quite an undertaking in attempting to subvert the way that most people understand that concept. Because
Oh,
obviously, if they had to talk about agorism within the context it uses to represent these concepts, the framework that it uses, they would have to compare the internal assumptions behind representing these concepts in property and ethical disputes as moral dilemmas rather than disputes in observing the nature of action, like how they're approached from a methodological perspective. And that wouldn't hold under scrutiny because you can't create repeatable methods based on moral propositions because they're based on self references.
and Weston says neural nets can only handle digital labeled data, which has been stored by humans. In continuation of that's because that's not how training a neural net works. Well, we're not describing training a neural net. We're not even describing creating a neural net. I mean, we're describing it in the context of how that inspired our a lot of our attempts to understand cognition and cognitive science. But I don't think anyone tried to describe an optimal method for training neural nets. Just that there was an
Notice
analogous, just that
how
there was an analogous structure. Sorry, I
analogous structure.
yeah, I'm bad with words right now. Probably because I'm focusing on two things at once. But yeah, analogous structure. This is the point that's actually important, not whether or not we're training better neural nets. That would be the effect of what we're trying to do, but it's not the primary objective. It's not even a secondary objective.
Notice how not a single one of the claims that we've presented has been contested on its technical grounds, at least not without reframing it in such a way where it practically misrepresents what we've claimed.
Well, I remember there was an accusation. I remember there was an accusation earlier in the stream that you've never read political science papers.
All right,
I mean, I study
that, that's
political. I
that's all I have to respond to that with.
yeah. That just what's the name of that system that they use in government schools to try to indoctrinate people into thinking that the only way to judge information is on the basis of its credibility?
The SIFT method.
Yes, that's it. I feel like
Yeah,
that's
you all should, who are asking us to refer to sources and are engaging in the logical fallacy of appealing to authority without realizing it. You should look up a technique of presenting how education is taught now in the context of academia, like what they consider to be a model of education. You should look up the SIFT method and then compare that to brainwashing techniques. But yeah, this response of where's your source, where's the peer review? That's a brainwashing tactic. It's called a thought stopping cliche.
all right. Here's
Basically, it's based on you becoming invested in a representation of what you are considering these concepts to be that's based internally on a self-referential understanding of what it is. So subconsciously you become emotionally invested in maintaining the perception of it, even though from your perspective it literally just looks like you are perceiving meaning in and of itself. But meaning in and of itself doesn't exist. That's your brain hallucinating. And you know that you're hallucinating because it's it's based on a self-reference, which from the functional perspective of what your brain is doing, that means that it's causing a psychological phenomena known as an epiphany, or it's causing the effect described as apophenia.
You can look up apophenia on Wikipedia if you're looking for a source, by the way. That's not a term we made up. Epiphany, however, is a term we are coining.
To describe a singular instance of apophenia occurring.
Exactly. It's like think of like an inverse epiphany. That's kind of the idea.
Yeah, if you perceive objectivity in your representation of reality, what that is it's you hallucinating in your perception of logic. Because that is something itself that your brain is representing, since your perception is gamed by the function of your brain.
No, thank you for demonstrating our point, Winston. You didn't have to do that, but he's just demonstrating exactly what we were talking about in terms of why it is that uh, this method is going to drive people who are used to operating within a propositional framework crazy, because his use of language here when he says, so you're telling me to reject my existing understanding because apparently I am crazy? No. No one is claiming you're crazy. We're not saying that like being driven by your ego means you're crazy, although I would characterize people or crazy people as having had the result of been driven crazy by their egos. Though the two, it's more of a cause and effect relationship, more so than a synonymous one. Oh, that's not good. Hello?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
I just didn't. I just didn't. What were
I,
you gonna say?
I was getting network connections on oh, wrong thing. I was getting network connections on Super Animal Royale, so I was just wondering if I had the internet cut out or something.
Oof. All right. Well, while the approach, I guess, on the hardware side of the actual blueprints of the things we would be building was becoming more and more sophisticated. This was happening in part in response to our understanding of logic in relation to information itself becoming more and more sophisticated as a result of many of the problems that we were running into in discourse. Um, Routinely contradicting the way that the role that discourse is supposed to serve in the context of the Socratic method. And one of the ways in which we were discovering this was represented best in, I think, three phenomena that we've been discussing quite a bit recently. Firstly, the fact that every single person has a different narrative of reality because of the fact that every single person's perceptions being emulated by their brain and therefore the information that they've encoded into it. Well, it means that language can't possibly refer to meaning external to oneself. So, a problem that emerges in the context of metaphysics is a phenomenon known as that Ludwig Wittgenstein refers to as a language game or language gamification, where every person refers to concepts in language represent something internally that they're attempting to signal, because people refer to language like a tool to represent something that's actually an internal process publicly.
Mm-hmm. So a good example of
And
this is like just take any object. I'm just going to take the water bottle in front of me. I'd say water bottle. The actual physical water bottle that is sitting on my desk next to me is completely different from what you may internally mean when I say the phrase when you hear me say the words water bottle. Your understanding of the term and the physical object are completely separate concepts.
So the problem that presented in trying to reflect on discussions of about ideology is, first of all, that implies that the perspective that someone is defending has an in part psychological component to it that's disconnected from the meaning they're attempting to portray itself, because of the fact that from a psychological perspective, language is a tool. But the other thing that implies is that objective meaning can't exist, simply observed in the way that language is used in psychology.
Yep.
But another I guess radicalizing philosophical influence was the work of someone named Jacques Ellul, specifically a series of 3 books that he wrote. Propaganda, the formation of men's attitudes, the technological society, and although this is pretty crazy, but actually we independently came to basically the exact same conclusions that Jacques Ellul describes in the 3rd book in his series, The Political Illusion, without having read it first, about the nature of propaganda and the effect that it would have on people as a result of the state's role in the environment, which is explained in the prior 2 books. And I don't even really know how to begin stating the implications that some of the concepts Ellul demonstrates in those books are. But would you like to take a crack at it first?
Oh God, where do we even begin? I mean, do we even have to
So I guess
discuss do we have to discuss the nature of technics, for want of a better term? Because we're starting to as we're fleshing out this philosophical movement, we're floating around a whole bunch of terms, and one of the ones that I've been seeing floating around quite a lot is either Franco-Austrianism and semiotechnics. The semiotechnics in particular is of particular interest because it's I think a good way to describe it, at least for me, the core of Jacques Ellul's philosophy is the concept of technique as separated from technology. Whereas technology is, of course, the physical tools that one uses to perform a certain task or to achieve a certain objective, technique is how you use them. Good example of this in action would be the computer you're using or the electronic device you're using to watch this stream right now. You know how to use it because you have the proper techniques for how to use them. However, you give the exact same device to, say, someone from the 1700s with in its charge, it's functional, it's everything, they wouldn't know how to use it. Not because they're stupid, but because they don't have the proper techniques for how to use it. They don't have the proper points of reference. And the development of that has been as important to the development of civilization, both for good and for ill, as had any one or numerous technological devices. And I think that particular concept has been particularly important because it demonstrates that not only is technological innovation itself important for how to subvert the state, but also the means by which we use tools, both current and future tools, to be able to subvert the ways, either by using them in ways that were never intended to be used or just using them indifferently. So
and
we not only have to figure out ways to use existing tools in better ways, but also figure out new ways to develop newer and better tools. So it's not just a technical problem. It's not just a technological problem. It's a technical problem. The two differentiated from one another. And good news about social problems, which the state fundamentally is. The the so, social problems are technical problems, and technical problems have technical solutions.
yeah, that's what we mean in using that mantra that we've shared around in a couple of the images that we were promoting our last 2 videos with. The notion of technique or techniques Well, one of the most significant implications of it is that it shows that the way that technology that you're presently using is designed and organization models that then attempt to adopt it into how they operate as organizations implicitly make assumptions about structures in the environment that have to be maintained in order for them to be designed that way in relation to other concepts to other constructs around it. So you can look simply at a production process and use the production process itself to reveal incentives that the state would have as an organization in defending and propping up that specific economic model. But you could apply this framework to how you inform your own perception because of the fact that perception is itself a technical mechanism.
And we know this for the reason that we described previously.
And that's not even a well, that's not a controversial concept. It is in the context of maybe Western academia, but you know what that is? I'm going to really blow your mind with this one. Look up a concept that Buddhists describe as self-cultivation, and then compare that to what I just described based on the context of what we've explained perception is.
Oh, but do you have a source for that? Peer reviewed?
No, it's just literally describing the exact same thing, and it's depicting it from a psychological and narrative perspective instead, the effects of it, and it's describing how you create it exactly how it would be created from a neurological perspective. But no, they're not describing the same concept.
I mean,
There's no peer-reviewed source that's proving it.
we have we have reasons to understand that the peer review process is not a very useful method for identifying patterns in our environment.
Well, take into consideration what we were just talking about in regards to technique applied to organizations. Think about the internal incentives that an academic would have informing the way that they continue to be an academic in the context of a university. Who's financing the universities and running them fundamentally? Well, the state, and the state's doing so as an extension of its own organization model. So obviously, peer reviewed sources are going to be biased against anything that undermines the state's propaganda model because they're not going to be able to get funding for resources that would be required to conduct studies. First of all, it would be subversive to the state's interests, and it would also be subversive to the interests of all of the other academics because it undermines the careers of people that have their economic incentives invested in defending their field.
And there's also one word that can summarize these problems entirely, fairly simply: accreditation.
So even if you're going to, oh, sorry.
I didn't say anything.
Well, even if you're going to like, if you're gonna look past the fact that appealing to authority is logically fallacious because it doesn't substantiate your claims with a technical method that's repeatable, even if you're gonna get past that, just looking at what universities are as organizations should put you into a position where you're skeptical about the conclusions of peer-reviewed studies. It's like, wow, scientist who is employed by Pepsi says there's nothing wrong with drinking Pepsi.
I can get really controversial by just pointing out Pfizer. Depends.
And yeah,
That point's unfortunately too spicy for YouTube. So
yeah. There's going to be subtopics that we literally can't go into on in any sense because we'll get immediately yeeted by TOS. But that doesn't mean we're not going to be talking about them. It just means that we'll be finding other ways.
As I said, the whole point is to point out or our whole method and why we find Jacques Ellul so interesting is because, yeah, he did direct our focus towards how to solve these problems in such a way of using existing technology in different ways. Unfortunately, the state also does this. However, one thing I have noticed is that the scope of their technique for how to influence people, it's becoming, and how to propagandize to people, it's becoming so absurd and obtuse that even people who are emotionally invested in these narratives are picking up on it for the reasons that we described like at the very beginning of the stream. Like freaking like every like even on like normie communities that I'm in, I haven't heard a single person say anything kind about Brian Thompson. The the most generous thing I've heard is, "Oh, you know, murder is wrong." And even people who are just like, "Yeah, that guy deserved to die," are just like, "Yeah, murder's wrong." So,
And if you see how the concept of propaganda is described in the concept in the book, the propaganda and the formation of men's attitudes. First of all, you'll see that it has to be accurate because it's consistent with the way perception emerges in a neurological context. But secondly, you'll understand why people that are getting emotionally invested in political ideologies are reacting with such consistently repeatable responses, which is the implicit assumptions created by the narrative that they're getting morally invested in is subtly influencing the way they perceive reality in such a way where it causes them to become emotionally invested in a perception that they don't even realize they created because it was created as a result of the subtext in which concepts were described in relation to each other. So in other words, your brain encoded it through narrative rules. You didn't even process it as a logical statement.
it is,
And that's how the modern propaganda model works.
yeah, pretty much. It's a propaganda model so subtle, none dare call it propaganda because that in turn, I mean, just think about it like this. It there's a very simple way of putting it, and the only reason I'm stumbling over my words is because I'm thinking about it as I'm saying it. The best way to describe it is we know that propaganda is not being used by the United States government because propaganda is only used by bad guy countries.
Yeah, it's even more insidious than that because the it's that tactic of presentation where meaning is conveyed through narratives, but the meaning that's constructed is presented in such a way that makes it internally impossible to argue against because it describes concepts in the implicit assumptions that they're presented in relation to one another in a way where your attention, because of your emotional investment, is always directed at certain lines of inquiry that strategically steer you away from ever looking at the state in a way that would allow you to question it to yourself. You can't It's not that you're not capable of critical thinking, it's you're so fucking brainwashed that you can't even identify the state as a concept that can be scrutinized.
It tries to pretend that it didn't exist. It tries to pretend that it didn't exist.
Oh, and you see this a lot on an interpersonal basis. Like this is basically just the tactic of of Darvo, except on on a mass scale and projected through sociological expressions of power relations.
And for those of you who
It's
don't know,
basically
like you might want to describe Darvo to people who aren't familiar with that term.
It's a manipulation tactic. It's an acronym and it stands for deny attack. DARVO. Deny attack
Reverse victim offense.
reverse victim offender. And it's a tactic that in practice is when someone engages in a behavior or engages in an action, but in the language that they present in signaling to other people, they present it as though it's not something that can even be identified. And the consequence of that is that they end up blaming who they acted on or what they did on some external influence, usually the person that they're directly acting on, which is why it's given that acronym.
Yeah. I
But
think. Sorry.
sorry, what were you gonna say?
Nothing
What
really.
were you gonna say?
Nothing. Continue.
Yes, I got cut off there by background noise. But essentially, what it looks like in practice is, say for example, somebody pushes and shoves someone to the ground. Then the person that pushed them and shoved them to the ground asks them why they fell to the ground. And if the person on the ground says because they were pushed by the other person, the person that pushed them initially would respond with, "No, actually, that's something that was going to happen anyway. I was reaching out because I was trying to catch you."
Not quite. Darvo, or at least my understanding of Darvo, looks more like. Are you accusing me? Are you accusing me of pushing you over? How dare you accuse me of pushing me over? Do you know what that's going to do to me? You know what it's going to do to my
Well, what I
reputation?
was Yeah, what I was representing was more the way that the state's propaganda model works and that kind of manipulation tactic applied to interpersonal exchanges, where the state constantly fucking causes issues that people complain about, and whenever people identify it, they try to create demographics in the context of their propaganda models to direct people's anger at what's generally referred to as the divide and conquer tactic. That's where they'll start. If that fails, then they'll start using scapegoats on their they'll start using scapegoats in their political economy, which is where they're at currently. And when the state yeah,
Sounds like
but yeah, when no, let's just continue. But yeah, the prop. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Now, what was I saying?
yeah, you were talking about the state and how they structure their propaganda models.
Okay. Um, a bit more specific. Sorry. Talking about. Oh, right. The way that the state presents itself in the context of propaganda is always framed outside of the perspective of the narrative. So the internal disputes that are happening in society are always happening within the internal logic of the incentives people are supposed to have in political economies. Because in the context of the state's propaganda model, the state is supposed to be defining the norms of society. So even acknowledging the difference between incentives within the political economy that's engineered as a result of incentives created by defining property titles, that even acknowledging that in and of itself is something that the state's propaganda model can't, because it would reveal by implication that the state is an organization that can then be identified as something to be scrutinized in the environment. So the way that the state and now I remember specifically what I was getting to, where I was going. Um, yeah, the state, if they can't get people pitted against each other, then they'll use a scapegoat in their political economy, usually the CEO of the firm that they contracted to carry out an operation that was tangentially related to what people are upset about, if that reaches a boiling point or if the specific thing they did makes people mad enough. And if this, that's basically what they'll fall back on, because that's what the state will try to do in order to that's basically its last stand in the context of its propaganda model. And unfortunately, it still, because a lot of people don't understand it, seems to work. But basically, no matter what or who the state blames for its failings, it will never be the organization model of the state or one of its incentives that it has because of a practical concern tied to its ability to sustain itself. Because as soon as that gets introduced into the equation, the game is up, because the state isn't just an abstract representation of power anymore.
I mean, I've described in my video the state's structure is a power maximizer.
It's exactly like how it's exactly like the way that Gramsci describes tactics in discourse that he articulated in developing critical theory, namely the framing of your position as always being uncontroversial, whereas you're always framing the perspective that you're against as though it's an intruder and as though its role is controversial in your environment.
All right, JC Armitage asks, do you think Trump is being set up as the state's next fall guy?
Possibly. I'm interested to see how this plays out, because I'm kind of on the fence currently as to whether or not the reaction that people are having to the selection is the result of the state genuinely buying its own bullshit and programming assumptions into how the algorithm curates content to people, and having shills who work for the Daily Wire put out takes that desync from the way that the narrative is like what the narrative is leading people to, the conclusions that people are supposed to be coming to because of the narrative. It makes me wonder whether or not they're having problems, controlling the fucking monstrosity that they've created, or whether or not that was intentional specifically for the purpose of trying to create a situation where they could be used as fall guys if the state isn't confident enough in starting its great leap forward yet.
I know for sure. I remember back in when was this, like 2023 early, when Trump's house in Florida, Mar-a-Lago, got raided by the FBI. I remember that being the moment when I knew he was going to win the United States presidency. Or maybe it was 2022. I'm not remembering. But I'm bringing it up because I also knew at that moment, and I remember telling people at the time, the state is going to pivot its propaganda model because it's going to start signaling to reactionaries. I probably wouldn't have used those terms at the time, but yeah, I could see that that's where it's going, and it seems that I'm not trying to say I told you so because I don't think very many people here would have heard it, but yeah, uh, that is something that definitely happened.
Well, from my perspective, it's, I don't even want to try to signal that, because I think what the more important takeaway from all of this is the fact that regardless of what you think about the state, your ability to continue self actualizing is not even going to be able to exist if the state continues to exist much longer.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
like I just say
That's
like
actively
flat out, like just flat out, the state is an active evolutionary pressure against sapience, against consciousness.
because think about what it's doing in designing the infrastructure of a proprietary internet that way, and think about from the perspective of its organizational interests what reasoning the state would have for that. oh, we're deliberately trying to just make it so people can't perceive what we're doing, so we could fucking continue raping all the children that we want, and nobody will ever fucking even call us out for it because they won't have the cognitive ability to even identify that as a problem. Yeah, fuck these people. How is that anything other than just the most malicious message that has ever been conveyed to anyone, let alone the entirety of human societies, other than, you know, the networks the states have created for themselves?
They want to be able to operate with impunity and with people who are willing to readily accept being both figuratively and literally screwed over. I mean, it kind of shows some of the motivation in them wanting to bring in Indians through the H-1B visa program, and I'm wondering why Indians specifically. That seems very odd to me. But
Yeah, specifically, what we need is to stop this internal divide and conquer bullshit, and instead direct all of our efforts towards the state.
mhm.
Fix your eyes on the state and understand that anything trying to take your eyes off of it is trying to manipulate your perception.
Yep. That's also why I push back on just culture war shenanigans in general, because that's all of that is designed specifically to get you specifically, dear viewer, to direct your attention at people who happen to hold preferences that may disagree with your own. And
Yeah,
that's
the
supposed.
entire.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you look at some of the core concepts that define the culture war narrative, it's very blatant that they're designed to subvert the study of action. I think probably the best example of this would be the concept of evolutionary psychology coupled with biological essentialism for explaining morality. If behavior is genetically inherited and morality is biologically determined, well, then what does that imply?
It
Basically
implies.
a recreation basically a recreation of eugenics but through narrative rules.
Mhm. We have to exterminate these groups of people because they hold the wrong preferences. They might. I'm sorry, I can't finish that sentence. It's too funny.
But
We
yeah,
have to
all of
stop.
that
We
is
have to stop. We have to stop the Browns from getting into the United States, because otherwise they'll vote wrong.
but yeah, the notion that tribalism is inherent to people, which is a concept that people that's been normalized as a result of the notion of the cathedral, which is central to the culture war narrative and a lot of NRX philosophy.
Can you really call
Well,
it
that in and
philosophy
of
though?
yeah, it really just seems to be a pathological justification for narcissism.
Also, these people.
In context of, I'm sorry, what were you saying?
I'm just saying, like from my experience, it's just that people who want to be racist but don't want to be perceived as racist for some reason. It's like, look, if you're gonna be racist, just own it. And I like racist humor as much as the next gamer, but it's like if you're gonna be unironically racist, just be like me and own it.
Considering that, I guess I'll just say this. I don't have any problem still with any individual person that identifies as reactionary because individuals still have their own perceptions. Even if they are brainwashed, they're still individuals, and it's important to never forget that because of the fact that their perception is something that's being informed by what's presently happening in their own minds,
Mm-hmm.
and that's going to influence the way that it continues functioning going forward. So the best possible approach to resolving our differences is honestly just getting past discourse and applying technique to method, by which I mean applying our developing a method that is strategically designed to create conditions in the environment as a result of it being performed, which make it impossible for other structures to exist that existed before the method was performed to continue. That's the approach to the state that we're encouraging, and what we mean by all social problems are technical problems, and all technical problems having technical solutions.
Hell, even if you
Basically, anything in the context of modern societies right now that is a quote unquote social issue, it's being caused by something in the environment. And even if the state wasn't there, that would still be the case, because even external expressions of behavior are still something that, relative to someone else's perception, is something in the environment they have to adapt to. So forgot where
these
I was going with that, but
my thinking is just that a lot of these ethnic, national, and otherwise groups, these racial groups, exist purely because of archetypes that are continually created and reinforced by the state, either acting on or claiming to act on their behalf or acting against them. I say against them because I have to include the Palestinians, who are, of course, stateless, but nevertheless are identified specifically because of them being systematically oppressed by, was real.
But as far as those three concepts that we have identified, well, based on the way that perception works and what happens when self references are created, and how narrative rules can subtly influence the conclusion you come to in a way that you can't perceive in your own representation of logic, yeah, all three of those notions together in a single narrative are pretty clearly intended to have a negative effect on one's psyche. Everyone can't fix their behavior because they're all just a group defined by something external to themselves as individuals, which simultaneously also can be a description of all of them interchangeably. And because this is something that can't be changed, the only thing that can be done about it is removing them.
Pretty much, yeah. It's it's going to be very difficult for me to ever take seriously people who unironically believe in some form of biological determinism, and then claim to be anything except a crap. I lost my train of thought there. It's going to be hard for me to take seriously people who claim to be individual, who claim to be against determinism, but unironically claim that racial determinism is a valid concept of study.
Yeah, those two perspectives can't coexist. And for the record, Lamarckism, which is the framework in the context of evolutionary biology that proponents of race realism attempt to cite to substantiate their claims by, conceptually, they do this on the basis that GWAS studies, basically the way that genes influence the development of certain certain metabolic functions of the body, or how the body produces certain chemical reactions that are that most studies attempt to apply to the context of how the body develops a structure, or the rules that it uses to produce chemical reactions. Evolutionary psychology, the framework that they're citing to justify these claims based on, attempts to create the perception of what it calls causal pathways through a correlation causation fallacy, basically citing GWAS studies and then also citing studies representing crime statistics just as an example, and attempting to claim that because they're both happening, there's a causal connection between the two. and that causal connection demonstrates the existence of causal pathways, which is what supposedly, from a conceptual perspective, is what explains behavior being biologically inherited.
Hmm.
So it's complete crap if you actually know conceptually how all of it works.
Yeah, and also I want to address this one thing that Rachel brought up because I actually can answer specifically what was brought up, which is that Muslims aren't doing enough to help fellow Muslims because Egypt hasn't opened their border to the Palestinians. There's the problem with that is that under international quote unquote law, to the extent that it's ever enforced, any refuge or any country that brings in refugees for any reason becomes legally liable for their welfare and well-being. And given that the
And
Gaza Strip has been in a state of siege since, if I recall correctly, 2005, so basically for the last 20 years, 19 to 20 years, maybe it's like 2007, I can't quite recall, but they've been under a constant siege. The majority of their the majority of the people in the Gaza Strip are, well, children. They're very, very young, and they're going to be malnourished, riddled with disease, and Egypt's going to take on that liability for millions or for like 1 to 2 million people. Like, what country's going to do that? Egypt's not exactly the richest country in the area either. They're not going to take on that risk.
I don't even really know what the point of that comment was, but I could explain very straightforwardly what's motivating the decision behind the Egyptian government there. It's because Egypt is also a NATO state.
Yep. And for the time being, having a problem demographic that is physically incapable of changing their behavior according to the wishes of NATO, then therefore the only solution for the Palestinian problem is the final solution. At least that's how it works within Israel's own internal reasoning, rather NATO's own internal reasoning.
And it's going to be just like Nazi Germany during the 40s. Oh, we didn't want to kill them all. The British government just blockaded us. Oh no.
We are
We just
complete.
had to do it, guys.
We are physically incapable of thinking or acting that otherwise the British government forced us to. We have no ability to make decisions or choices of our own. We are actually
But
the
you know, it's
helpless victims.
because of the fact that organizationally you can prove that they're coordinating together, what's really happening is it's more like they're creating a scheme where they can perpetuate the side and make it look like it was just the result of a plan falling through.
Even though it's like, even though we have like multiple statements from the officials in the Israeli government clearly signaling that, yeah, they want to wipe people out. They just want to kill people. Hell, they have a military policy called mowing the grass, where it's their intent to keep them in a constant state of siege mentality by doing airstrikes to cause massive collateral damage and population damage every couple of years or so. You can look it up, mowing the grass.
Oh, and the phenomenon that was referenced of siege mentality. That's actually something that anybody who's watching this should probably look into themselves because it's if it is ever referenced in the context of ideological disputes, I've heard the behavior that emerges out of it portrayed as though that's just what happens when the government isn't around. But no, siege mentality is a state of mind that emerges when, in someone's perception, they don't have the ability to sustain themselves. So from their perspective, they're not invested in anything, and they don't have anything to lose. So they start engaging in wild behavior. That's not something that emerges because there isn't a state. It's something that emerges because if governments just collapse, they've engineered the environment around them itself so that the only organizations which could emerge presuppose that a political economy has to exist in their own technical function, so that a state then has to emerge in order for anything to exist in those environments.
Basically, they made it. They basically created the warlords problem. If you if
The infrastructure itself is an extension of technique, and it's an extension of techniques that have been designed around the state's organizational interests for thousands of years. It's a big problem.
and now I'm just kind of following, like passively following the discussion in chat. I'm not going to comment on whether or not someone should attempt to associate with Mentis Waves community. That's all I'm going to
Yeah,
say
you
on
can go
that.
ahead and do. You go ahead and do that if you want. Just not gonna have any productive experiences out of it, based on what I've seen.
Yeah, never met the guy. Never talked about the guy I'm referring to Mentis Wave. Never interacted with him. Hell, I've never don't even think I've watched any of his videos, at least not intentionally. So all I really know about him is that he's he's a paleo.
Yeah,
Probably.
I've seen some of his content, and while I'm not exactly sure if I'm going to be responding to any of it, uh, intellectually speaking, it very much comes off like the right wing equivalent of those like bedroom Marxist YouTubers that just read the first few lines on a Wikipedia article to inform their understanding of anything.
So he's a
That's
Hopian.
that's very much that's very much the vibe that Mentis Wave's content gives off.
I'm sorry. I used a archetype again. He performs the actions of a Hopian.
Yeah.
Apparently, James was banned he was banned immediately after everyone got unbanned because they have a
Yeah,
their
like
head. Apparently, their head moderator is a self-identified fascist.
oh yeah, and that was one of the things. That was one of the things that I saw coming out of that community. The supposed Austro-libertarian Discord server has a fascist that in their bio openly describes it being a virtue to manipulate people psychologically, which is a tactic that react the culture war community, specifically following the neo-reactionary philosophies, have started adopting, which is the reason why I just outright I'm a bit more comfortable with adopting the perspective that stating I've adopted the perspective that I have, which is in response to that I don't consider their perspectives intellectually, as in I disregard them on the grounds that they're defending those approaches to philosophy because they internally frame the act of engaging in discourse and promoting specific concepts through narratives as an expression of will to power. In other words, they think basically that they can just lie to people and manipulate people's behavior into manifesting sociological phenomena that can't exist into existing. So if your philosophy has basically adopted the secular equivalent of takia, then why should I be listening to it?
You're gonna need to explain what takia is.
Oh, it's a concept in Islam that essentially is the notion that someone can engage in bad faith discussion if they're doing so for the purpose of continuing to defend the narrative of Islam.
You can lie, you can cheat, you can steal, you can do whatever you want, just as long if it serves the purpose of promoting Islam and getting more people to convert, then it's perfectly justified. I mean
Which
that's
that to me beyond just making it so the belief system has to be disqualified from intellectual consideration, I think is also a pretty massive concession of the fact that it can't survive scrutiny.
Yeah, pretty
That
much.
literally, in order for it to continue being promoted, there is internally a heavy emphasis put on lying to people in order to manipulate them into coming to these conclusions. If there's something that are so straightforward it could be perceived as quote unquote common sense, then why do you need to brainwash people into perceiving it?
This is this is also primarily a big problem that I have with Hoppians in general because they do the same freaking thing. I mean, hell, it's like Hop himself. That's basically his shtick: lie and manipulate and trick people into going along with his blatantly obvious neo feudalism.
Yeah, I think really Hoppianism is it's a belief system that should be cited to demonstrate how you can promote a psychological narrative that manipulates someone's perception into coming to conclusions outside of their conscious reasoning. Because that's basically what Hoppianism is. It's not a metaphysical understanding of approach to logic. It's not an attempt at articulating any sort of coherent metaphysical belief system beyond simply the secularized equivalent of presuppositional apologetics, the Hegelian dialectic, in other words, except framed in the context of idealism as opposed to Marxists, which framed it in the context of materialism. But yeah, Hoppianism is a belief system that's basically just designed to manipulate you into perceiving the conclusions that are being presented to you as though that was actually your perspective all along. And
Do you identify with this particular ideological archetype called libertarianism? Well, that means you believe this. Oh, what?
and
Is your belief even slightly different? Well, that just means that you have a low time preference. Or
this
is it a
is
high time
done
preference? I don't remember.
primarily This is done by using two discourse techniques that have been known about since ancient Greece, and even because of the effect that they have on the psyche. One of them is called syncretism, which is where you represent multiple different competing conceptual ideas into a single narrative so that the narrative combines all of them even though they contradict each other, so that they can all be accepted even though they contradict each other within a single coherent belief system. Papa does this all the time. In fact, the most famous example of this the one that you would be the most familiar with, Heretic, is the conceptual justification behind framing secession as an example of decentralization in organization methods.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah, if you believe in libertarianism, that means you believe in using political action to achieve your preferences.
Well, you're saying that you like decentralization. I like political decentralization, and secession is decentralization in a political context. We're describing the same concept. That's not what I'm describing. Oh, yes, it is, because you said you like decentralization, right? Which, that's the other half of the tactic. It's a dialectic method that the Socratic method itself is based on, called elenchus, which is basically the narrative of a statement is presented in such a way where the narrative forces you to create a proposition. It prompts you to create a proposition outside of your conscious perception through narrative rules. And because you don't have an internal reasoning behind why you created that proposition, if you accept it, then the person who's employing the tactic then says, well, you made that connection because of this, this, and this.
And you want to
It's a brainwashing tactic that, in the context of modern psychology, is called memory reprogramming.
I have 4 words that subverts that function entirely. Beetle in the
I
box. All of that.
Beetle in a box.
All of,
Except I said I assume nothing, which is dumb on a couple levels.
well, I said 4 words, not 3.
But that's also that's a defense against Elenchus, because if they can't get you to agree to make a proposition, as I pointed out, there's several tactics in language itself that are designed to subtly manipulate you into making one if you're not careful.
It's something that
And yeah, but yeah, the combination of those two tactics has been hellish to try to deconstruct because of how psychologically manipulative it is. The combination of using equivocation and simultaneously the Mott and Bailey tactic.
now for those of you who
It
don't
makes it.
know, sorry.
I was gonna say you basically have to study all of these schools of thought and understand how internally they represent concepts, and understand that in a way where you can emulate that in your own thought process in order to be able to call out this bullshit.
Yeah, and for those of you who aren't aware, the beetle in the box was a thought experiment developed by Ludwig Wittgenstein regarding the nature and function of language games, where you get a bunch of people together, you give them all identical boxes, which may or may not have different items or a different single item inside, and the goal of the game is to convince other participants that what you have inside of your box is a beetle. So, and you're not allowed to show them what's inside. You can only use descriptors to get them to and convince them that what's inside the box is a beetle. So you could describe the beetle, for example, as a yellow thing with a yellow fruit with a peel, and you have to convince them that that's a beetle.
Now, if you don't know what physically is represented by the inside of the box, which you can't because of the nature of the situation, someone could simply tell you that it's a beetle, and they could say they have a beetle, but to your own representation of how you're creating meaning, what does that mean? Because you can't reference anything that other than your own understanding of it, which you have no context functionally to provide to represent it with.
But here comes Hop coming along just saying, well, what you have is, or if you have a beetle in the box, that means what you have is this. You open the box, your own box rather, and you see like what you have is completely different, and all Hop does is gaslight you into thinking that libertarianism is actually when kings and lords own everything, and you just work their land on their behalf.
Yeah, he and proponents of his quote unquote method frame the use of presuppositions as though they're talking about like cheat codes in logic, where they can just use them as a way of justifying conclusions that they can't demonstrate, even though they can't demonstrate that they exist as an implication of this. Like if you don't have a technical method that you're basing your internal understanding of what's happening on, then how do you know that's actually what's happening? It's not just your brain fucking with you. Not in the sense that something physically that's happening in the environment isn't actually occurring, but how do you know that the way you're representing it to yourself is accurate? Taking a sip.
Chatters stay silent for a long time when we're inspired to do. Yeah, that's usually how chats go. Sorry, I was just reading out that chat from Rachel to myself.
All right.
I don't know if anyone has anything else to they want to add. They are free to. Let's see
Yeah,
here.
I was just reading the chat for a second as well. I mean, there's more to go over in the context of logic and information that like there's more developments, there's more steps to go over. Sorry if I was struggling to choose words there, but there's a lot more that we would need to explain that I honestly would need more time to probably like reflect back on to see how some of those steps occurred. But um, because because as a result of some of the complications that we ran into in trying to network outside of the legal economy, it left us in a situation in 2022 where we could only really continue expanding upon what we'd already learned. And that led to a chaotic period that was very dull at the same time. It was demonstration to me that chaos can be very depressing from your own perspective. But yeah, it led to a lot of it led to a lot of us understanding a lot of what we just explained here, and a lot of it would also require citing like the concept of centering from Derrida's philosophy, or Deleuze, in how Deleuze describes perception from the perspective of what he calls difference and repetition. That wasn't an inspiration on how we're describing the process of cognition. How we're describing the process of cognition is something that we realized in simply studying psychology and the structural nature of the brain, and then realized that his description of it was technically accurate. After ANCAT mainly kept saying that, well, it was ANCAT and PC kept telling us that what we're describing sounds a lot like Deleuze's work, and I hadn't read Deleuze, so
It's interesting how often this is happening, where we just end up recreating a lot of philosophical thought just by breaking apart metaphysics of something that's either semi-related or unrelated. I think the first instance I can think of is actually the in the Hop essay from 2019, where we successfully reconstructed basically the entirety of discourse ethics from argumentation ethics just by breaking down its metaphysics.
yeah, and you can also see that based on how it developed intellectually, that it very clearly is derived from the framework of universal pragmatics, as Hoppe explicitly cites Jürgen Habermas's work as the intellectual inspiration behind it, and specifically cites the concept of discourse ethics, which is based on this framework in critical theory called universal pragmatism, which is basically just a recreation of dialectical materialism in an idealistic context.
Anyways, JC Armitage wants to know if we know about the rat utopia as as a refutation of libertarianism.
I have not heard that one, but if anything, it's an example of what trying to socially engineer environments around people as a way of controlling their behavior actually does take into a logical conclusion. I have absolutely no idea how it's being presented as a refutation of libertarianism, because that is, if anything, the environment that was constructed, that the rat utopia the rat utopia took place in resembles modern societies and modern infrastructures designed around centralized organizations.
Hmm.
And the psychological effect that was observed in the rat utopia experiment is pretty clearly the result of people being forced into positions of subservience to proprietary organizations, and as a result unable to self-actualize their own interests, so they just kind of go blank psychologically. What's described as having your head under the water.
And no, no one's saying that we're claiming that the rat utopia failed because they formed a state. What we're talking about is a society that was formed specifically under with a set of conditions that were highly controlled and highly proprietary. Not highly, they did straight up were proprietary. And apparently, some guy called What If Falthist. Am I spelling that correctly? What if Alf?
What
What
if
if?
all history?
Yeah, did a 10-hour stream about it. Let me see here. 10. So what if Althus apparently had a 10-hour meltdown? Yeah, no, I don't know anything about that. I don't even know who that is.
One of the bigger channels that makes content about alternate history, and his brother runs that account, Knowledge Hub.
I know about Knowledge Hub. He had some kind of meltdown, I
Well,
guess.
I have not seen it, and I don't really watch. I don't really watch their content. But if that was the premise of the 10-hour meltdown, well, then he had a 10-hour meltdown over a false premise. That you could have an example of the social norms that libertarians would describe as a free society in an environment like the rat utopia was structured around. Because the ability to actually engage in behavior without being oppressed happens as the result of you being able to engage in behavior and inform your own behavior without anything external to your own agency acting as something that's preventing you from doing that in your own mind. And if you're literally designing the environment in such a way where it limits the possible options of behavior that someone can express, then that's going to gradually have a degenerative effect on their own perception of themselves, where it becomes less and less sophisticated until the conclusion of the rat utopia happens, where people are just engaging in fucking pack behavior mindlessly without any sense of self. A very similar, and the reason why I even consider it analogous to try to compare the outcome of the rat utopia to human psychology is because a very similar phenomenon happened during the Great Leap Forward. Around the time where the crop started failing. You can listen to people that lived through it describing it. It's pretty interesting.
I'm just reminded of a lot of the propaganda surrounding declining birth rates, and I'm just thinking that everything that you're describing about that fits more into explaining why it is that birth rates are declining in the West than any of the other kind of nonsense that is normally ascribed to it. The state has actively created a depressive social and psychological mechanism ingrained into the state, one that's actively, or that, at least in my perception, reeks of desperation for the simple fact that their ability to maintain their organizational model is still in rapid decline. It has been continuing to decline for a while now, will continue to decline for some time. However, the
They've
actions that they need
created
to
an
take
envi-
create an environment. Sorry?
I was just gonna say they've created an environment that's made people so sick it's making them leave their bodies and rediscover God. Anyway, what were you gonna say?
It's certainly doing something. Mainly, like there's a couple or attempts at a Christian revival movements. I don't think they're going to actually be going anywhere, but they're trying, and there is at least an attempt to try to find something that resembles meaning, even if they're trying to do so through an objective universal framework.
Oh yeah, the Catholic Church creating a lolly mascot for themselves, literally named Lucy. Yeah, they're convincing people of their non-sinister intentions for sure.
Oh, don't worry, they can totally be trusted. I promise. I know that Lucy's supposed to be an Italian name, but I mean, did no one say anything, or are they just because like it's like going to Germany and having your first name be Hit and your last name be Lur on your passport.
Yeah, I can't, especially because of the fact that the character is also a lolly, which for anyone who doesn't know, that's a psychologically manipulative character design that's intended to get you emotionally invested in an archetype. You should look up the effect that the brain has in response to a perception and aesthetic known as the baby schema. So they literally created a fucking psychologically manipulative archetype that's named Lucy, that's designed to cause you to create an ego that causes you to become emotionally invested in the Catholic Church as an organization. It's like they're just openly telling people, yeah, we're evil. Our perception of God is actually what most people think of as Lucifer.
Also, by the way, it's not spelled Lucy, it's Luci. You know the first four letters in Lucifer. Come the
Uh,
I really don't want to swear
which,
because swearing is YouTube unfriendly, but come the on. Can you make it
Which
any
for
less
those of you who don't
obvious?
know, which for those of you who don't know, moral ideologies and gods are the same concept psychologically. As belief systems, they work the same way. Well, more accurately, moral ideologies and religions that depict specific concepts of God. Whatever quote unquote God is, you'll notice that it's always described in such a way where it's in how concepts are described in relation to one another. It's depicting what the concept of God is in a very specific way, and what it essentially translates to in the context of any given narrative, at least in the context of Christianity, is the narrative perspective that's representing the statement itself, disconnected from the person who's reading it, because it's not written as though it's supposed to be the perception of the person reading the statement. So it's kind of like creating a blank narrator in the way that your brain processes narrative rules. And if those quote unquote gods have perspectives of value judgments ascribed to them, then the purpose of the spiritual narrative is to create that construct in your narrative of reality by representing it in aesthetic.
So, I mean, it sounds like we're just sitting here talking about the church, engaging in posturing, but no, there's actually very deliberate reasons behind all of it. That if you understand what's happening, if you understand the way that the brain processes spiritual narratives is very sinister about that choice.
And yeah, J.C. Armitage, that is why social justice sounds exactly like a religion. Because they use the exact same freaking psychological mechanisms to get you emotionally invested in whatever shenanigans they're engaged in at the moment. I mean, can you blame them? What other means do they have to convert people to their nonsense other than just through manipulation tactics? I mean, at least Islam's open about it.
Yeah, that's the most insidious aspect of the way that propaganda models are expressed in the present context is there's no way to identify them within each individual piece of media itself. You have to refer to the context in which it's being presented to people relative to everything else going on in that instant. And that's a very difficult thing to even prove to yourself because you're not constantly like watching other people. But you could see in the way that content is curated to you that it very clearly is based on your search history or what you've shown interest in. Look, just about everybody by now has probably had one of those experiences where they're talking about something and watching YouTube shorts, and then the next few YouTube shorts are videos of the thing that they were talking about.
Hell, I remember it's like I talk about a game that I haven't played in years on uh, what is it? On on another Discord server, and then right after I'm getting videos about that game suddenly. I think yeah, and as you
Well,
said,
yeah.
we've all had that experience.
Now consider that in relation to certain topics, because the AI that's curating content is proprietary, it means that the people running the platform can manually program into it basically fixed rules for specific content creators that it references content from. So if those content creators are framing these concepts in such a way where it perpetuates the narrative that the state promotes in its propaganda model in the next sequence of content that is presented to people after people are describing these same concepts in such a way that in a way where it doesn't necessarily conform to the state's propaganda model within its own within the self-contained context of that piece of media, then when the next piece of media is curated to them, they'll outside of their own conscious perception, unless they realize this is happening, they'll use the narrative of the propaganda video to fill in their context for understanding what was presented to them in the previous video. So literally, the way that platforms are designed has made it impossible for rational discourse to happen unless this is acknowledged and actively like people study this and try to exercise the way that they inform their own perceptions. Yeah, it's a bit much, but there hasn't really been a problem like this before. I mean, social stratification is really the closest equivalent to it, but this is like the human species beginning to fracture on a psychological basis and developing in ways where they're fundamentally not compatible with each other.
I think it's been that way for a while. It's just that the internet has caused these divisions to become significantly more. I don't want to say exaggerated because that implies that it's that these observations aren't accurate. What I want to say is that it's more apparent that there are certain psychological states that just simply are not compatible with each other anymore.
And it's simply revealed in the way that the state has to direct people to act in order to continue functioning as an organization, where the people that are invested in it are just like fucking raving lunatics and are just rabid and impossible to talk to for anybody that's not invested in the culture war narrative or some narrative that recreates its or some belief system that effectively recreates its rules.
I
If you're
remember.
not if you're what were you gonna say? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just remarking that I actually remember having a conversation with my dad a couple days ago, particularly about Japan and the sorry state of it in multiple levels, like economically, socially, and I've seen the effect that continual politicization and the complete disintegration of his understanding of how politics and its relationship to the people works. That it's I've seen it actually, like, it's starting to drive him crazy, and he's the only one that can't see it. He's created a whole lot of very, very strange takes that he unironically believes and has expressed to me. Particularly, like, he thinks that the United States is covertly supporting Hamas in Gaza as a ploy to wipe out, as a ploy to wipe out Israel. I've expressed that to you before, but I don't know if I've ever said it on stream.
Yeah, you've said it to me before, and I had the same reaction before. It's a take for sure.
Let me rephrase that actually, because there's a few details I missed that actually make it funnier. Barack Obama and his organization specifically are directing the United States government to fund Iran, who in turn funds Hamas to destroy Israel.
I think my favorite brain blast moment from somebody that was trying to defend the culture war narrative was Mike Lindell this year at the DNC. Remember that?
Yes. Oh, that's so funny. Go ahead and tell the story.
I fucking anybody who's watching this, you should go ahead and look up this clip afterwards. It is it's fucking amazing. It should be used in hindsight as an example in classes in the future to show people what people were doing before they realized how brainwashing was affecting their perception. But Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, he went undercover, quote unquote, to try to get gotcha takes from just random people that were attending the DNC in this last year. And his disguise itself was literally like fucking Hunter S. Looks like Hunter S. Thompson after he's been living on the street, addicted to meth for a few years, but like somehow also overweight.
I found the clip.
Anyway,
I found the clip.
yeah. All right.
Let's see if I can. I'm gonna try to get this on. I'm gonna try to get this on stream. Go ahead and continue.
Okay, but there's there's a point in this clip where he finds some fucking little kid that's just like in the crowd. I don't know if they were like there on a school assignment or something, but they were with some like parent group, and he was like, this kid was there acting as like a mock journalist trying to ask people questions. This was who Mike Lindell chose to start a debate with over election results in 2020. And that's not even the best part. The best part is that in the process of trying to engage in this argument, literally, it was just Mike Lindell the entire time getting himself riled up and making emotionally charged accusations in response to the kid just asking simple questions about some of the assumptions in his premises. Like, how do you know that? What is that based on? What are you basing that on? And at a certain point, and this was the part that I just died laughing at the first time that I saw it. At a certain point, he attempts to cite some suspicious behavior that the state of Georgia allegedly engaged in with the DNC. I don't remember exactly what the point he was making specifically was, but then the kid just asked him one of these questions again, like, "How do you know that?" And he fucking responds with, "You know because you've seen him."
I got a clip right here. It's on YouTube Shorts, and I think it's like 27 seconds long. Oh no.
That Now, the reason that happened psychologically is because, in the context of the culture war narrative, the person defending the claim, the organization of the Democrat Party, and the government are represented by the same, like, conceptual interest. So, in the context of the narrative, the perspective of some random 12-year-old is going to be based on the same context that informed the entire state of Georgia's decision making.
Apparently.
And that was an example of him trying to apply that to discourse without thinking about it, or probably even consciously realizing that, like he wasn't thinking about the words coming out of his mouth clearly, because after he says it, he has this apoplectic response where you can even see it. It's like he processed the words that came out of his mouth after he said them and realized how fucking stupid it made him sound.
Oh no, I can't get audio. Crap.
Like, I honestly almost kind of feel bad for him. Because he just freaked out at a 12-year-old on camera in a video that was meant to be used. It was meant originally to be an expose on the Democrat Party.
And all he did is just make himself look like like himself. So I'm not able to play it because I wouldn't be able to get audio for it. So unfortunately, you'll have to look it up on your own, dear viewers. But suffice to say, it is not a good look for the man. And it's a pretty good example of exactly what I'm talking about, where politicization drives people crazy. Now, back to what I was describing with my own dad. Uh, what the heck is going on with Japan makes absolutely no sense to him, and he's trying really hard to figure out why the hell they're still in decline, both socially and economically. He can't figure it out because, as far as he's aware, there is no organized attempt internally within Japan to cause Japan to cease existing. That's
Pretty
it.
wild the conclusions that you could come to when you're not looking at states as organization models. Because
The the
what
only
the fuck
reason the
do you mean?
states.
What
The,
the fuck do you mean the current incarnation of the Japanese government could exist without the US government? Their fucking banking system was literally created by the US's government to be dependent on US dollars. So it's like a system created on top of a Ponzi scheme, and that system is also a Ponzi scheme within its own internal reasoning.
I'm still just trying to get over that. His confusion over the continued state of Japan and why it's in decline not being correlated to an organization that wants Japan to stop existing, just confusing the hell out of him, is really funny to me. because he thinks that that's the primary cause for all of America's problems. There's just this organization that just doesn't want America to exist conceptually.
It's like there's a group of people in black robes that get together in the dead of night discussing, now how do we turn all of the Americans into browns?
What, they aren't like that?
So it seems to be what they believe sincerely is happening.
Yes. It's certainly news to them that when people aren't like that.
But I guess to wrap this up, well, we can talk about one of the new series that we're going to probably begin working on first, which is explaining the method that's come as a result of some of the approaches to studying action and various other topics we discussed in this stream has produced. Which
Yeah, you want to talk
for
about the you want to talk about the spicy name campaign?
I suppose that we should start by describing some of the key concepts that are required to understand it, which could be which so far I've only represented in the form of a couple of graphs that I made that I released alongside the story of SO video. But the main one is the organization of consciousness and everything that's required to understand that, which is three. You want to explain it?
No, you go ahead. I think you can explain it better than I can.
So recall what what we've been talking about the entire stream about the nature of human psychology as a result of the fact that it is a system that exists within the structure of the brain. And then the implications of, if you study the nature of the brain and see how it works as a mechanism, being able to compare how it functions as a mechanism to psychological phenomena, to then use that as context to compare the perception that you're creating to the mechanical functions of your brain. Now imagine if you could represent the state of mind that emerges as a result of being able to do this constantly in the form of narrative constructs, exactly like a system of spirituality. Except this system of spirituality, quote unquote, directs you towards revolutionary organization. It's a technical method, sort of like how dharmic systems approach informing perception, but applied to the context of action and organization itself by using the framework that we've called technosemiotics as the way to base claims off of, as the framework to base claims off of. Do you want to explain technosemiotics?
I think we already explained it. The idea.
We mentioned it, but we didn't really explain what it was.
All right. Well, then I think you can go ahead.
Well, there's two methodological frameworks that have emerged out of some of the studying that we did and some of the writings that we created, bouncing ideas off of each other, and those are studies that have been informally referred to as Franco-Austrianism and technosemiotics. Now, the Franco-Austrian method is exactly what it sounds like. It is an expansion upon the Austrian study of economics, but it approaches the Austrian method
with the context of a couple of core concepts developed by French intellectuals, hence the name Franco-Austrian. And those core concepts were primarily from the works of Jacques Ellul, Jean Baudrillard, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Deleuze. But basically, what it is it's an approach to understanding the study of action, except instead of presenting the study in the form of propositions that are meant to represent expressions of action, instead, because action is the internal reasoning behind any given action, is going to be based on the internal rules of one's perception at any given moment, and that is itself going to be influenced by both what's being emulated consciously and simultaneously the possible ways in which one can express their behavior. This approach to the Austrian method articulates praxeology as an extension of technique itself and simultaneously a value neutral study of human action, based on understanding that psychology is informed by perception from the perspective that perception is being created by the structure of the brain. And technosemiotics is the process of understanding how internally, based on economic incentives, expression of technique in a praxeological sense would work towards achieving profit, or basically what incentives it would create by implication of being enacted, and consequently how that would then influence the perceived implications in future actions. But from the perspective again of understanding that psychology is being emulated by the perception of the by the function of the brain. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. Pardon me. But
I think it's
it
happening
gets
to me
across
too.
but it gets across, I guess, a good way of summarizing it. Basically, imagine Austro-libertarianism, except instead of ideals or moral concepts, everything is just technique, and every economic model is an expression of technique, every perception is an expression of technique, and all of them have influences on one another that can be observed, which is the reason conceptually why they're justified as expansions to the Austrian method. They can explain phenomena that current attempts at articulating Austro-libertarianism can't. For example, the land calculation problem that Hayek mentioned in the 1950s. Basically, the problem with economic calculation that's introduced to firms operating in the political economy, based on the fact that land only exists as a property in the context of property norms of societies where property norms are based on titles, because of the fact that it's defended by a title. Because you can't demarcate land as something separate from any other scarce resource that you can act upon. So land titles create a similar issue in the context of property to intellectual property, where it's representing something that's not actually a resource that can be represented in an economic context, unless there's a socially engineered system creating incentives or senses of risk that steer people towards treating it as such in the context of property norms.
Sorry if I'm not saying anything. I got distracted for a bit.
No, it's all right. But those two
So if you understand those approaches to the study of action and all of the concepts implied by the existence of action, well, one of the it leads to many different conclusions, but it's required in order to understand the internal reasoning behind how we designed this approach to organization and why we compare it to a ritualistic practice. It's because the internal logic of it is that you're at in its inception, you are performing this at first for the goal of obtaining economic self-sufficiency, what we call economic self-sufficiency, as the basis of the organization that you then create your network on. So the way that you would begin setting up this approach to organizing outside of the state would begin very similarly to like a labor operation where you're putting together the resources and the people to create the network, but in the process of building the resources, you develop an interpersonal sense of trust with them based on working with them to create the economic model that's an expression of all of your senses of profit interchangeably, which is then expressed into the technique of the economic model of organization itself. So it creates a kind of organization that you can't really express in the context of how academia currently tries to represent organization theories and economic models, because of the fact that it in part plays on psychological phenomenon that incentives within an economic model itself can't create.
I just want to sidetrack here for a bit because I can see in the chat that for some reason, some person who hasn't changed at all since we last met them has decided that they wanted to make this about FNET again, even though we already addressed that. Must have just joined the stream. I mean, yeah, Rachel's got some
Yeah,
good advice. If you want some of the things that you want FNET to do for you, a lot of those components already exist, which is something we discovered and
yeah.
are currently incorporating into the current iteration of the project. The reason that there hasn't been much about it is because it's still being worked on as we speak. We're not going to be giving away progress reports constantly. That would just take away too much time and attention, not to mention that it would create a sense of obligation.
But what I just explained is the economic side and I guess sociological side of the first step of participation in the method, which is the organization model you have to set up, which we've called PENS or PPEN for short. It's an acronym for Post Political Economic Network, and it's named aptly after what its purpose is, which is to create an environment for you and the people that you're networking with where you have absolutely no external financial dependencies on the political economy so that you can direct your own behavior based on norms that you inform through your own extensions of technique.
Yeah, so part of
And this, sorry.
I was just going to remark that if you want some kind of progress report on some of the stuff we developed as part of the FNET project, what you want to look for is some of the things that you want to be able to use in your life, and what we're developing is a technique that allows you to be able to be self-sufficient. I say it's a bit more important a than a mesh network router. I'm not saying it's the correct way. You can still value the mesh network model, but I'm just saying that there's more than one way to do a thing, Not to mention that
Yeah.
some of the things that you want, as I said already, and as Rachel said already in the chat, a lot of those components already exist. And part of What we want to do is to be able to combine them in ways in which sometimes some of those combinations already exist. Sometimes they have compatibility layers built in. Sometimes they
Yeah,
need
and
to have those developed.
I pointed this out in the story of Esso, but what I was stating about the state operating strategically as an organization model, that's not even controversial from the state's perspective. It's just that most sociological constructs are discussed within the framework of political science in universities. But if you actually want to see scholars discussing strategy, specifically in regards to the government trying to maneuver around rebel groups or how it tries to preserve its organization internally against threats, that you can find, yeah, you can find untold volumes of material dedicated to this labeled under counterterrorism research. And that's one of the things that quote unquote counterterrorism research describes extensively about the state's model of organization is that their ideal approach to trying to undermine dissident movements is by engineering into the environment and playing into a dynamic which they call defection constraint. Now, what defection constraint is, in its most basic sense, is cost that can be leveraged against models of organization by preventing them from being able to access resources to sustain themselves, or by trying to disrupt trust internal to the organization through controlled opposition tactics and trying to demoralize people. So basically, it's try to pin people down into a situation where they can't maneuver and can't continue fueling their operation, and then cut them off, kind of like an embargo.
They cert-
That
I believe you were
sorry, what were
describing it
you
to
gonna?
me when you were introducing me to this topic along the lines of if you, not you specifically, of course, but just in general, don't believe that the state, or you don't believe that the state is an organization and that people should organize along that assumption because you think it's an incorrect observation, then you're at a disadvantage because that's how the state certainly believes. That's how the state certainly perceives it.
And the method of organization that I'm describing was influenced in response, in part, by the strategies that the state uses specifically to try to undermine dissident groups. And I created a model of the most subversive kind of organization to the state because of the fact that it can exist without external dependence on a political economy, that those tactics will be ineffective against because of the fact that it is economically self sufficient in four categories that allow someone producing techniques that achieve these four ends will make it so no one has to refer to any other source for fueling their operation. Those four categories are food, medicine, hardware, and power.
And a lot of them are interconnected. I mean, I know that Douglas is currently designing not even designing, like he's building prototypes for wind turbines that literally anyone can make.
But yeah, if you could produce your own power, then you could power your own hardware. Produce your own hardware, then you can make anything and design anything. You can accomplish that, then you have complete control over the techniques you use to achieve everything else.
There is an organization called the Open Ecology Institute. Like, as far as I can tell, they don't have any particular political or anti-political viewpoints. However, a lot of the things that they've been trying to do are incredibly useful for what we ourselves are attempting to do within our groups, where they've actively realized that a lot of hardware for even like doing basic stuff like digging ditches and refining ores is proprietary. So they come up with the idea of, hey, wait a minute, if we had open source hardware, machines that anyone can just make and have the schematics for, then we would be, then people could just, build cooler stuff all the way up to being able to build things like a house. And so their whole goal was to be able to build an open source house, which they did in 2018. And they have a lot of those blueprints available for free on the site or on their website. I don't recall what the URL is off the top of my head, but yeah, I mean, it takes a little bit because their website's a little tricky to navigate, but you can do that. That's a thing. So yeah, just more emphasis on exactly what we were talking about before, where a lot of the stuff that we want already exists. Just a matter of figuring out how to use it.
Well, and the technical basis for putting together blueprints that would allow you to create economic models off of this already does exist. It's just a matter of, creating the blueprints and experimenting. But, yeah, I guess the first back to the concept of post-political economic networks. Now that's important to understand in performing the method because it's not just that it is self-sufficient from political economies, but that it causes people to become self-sufficient from political economies based on a common foundation, and you'll understand why in a moment. But the other concept, but the reason why economic self sufficiency is so important is because if someone becomes economically self sufficient, then they no longer have the sense of pressure that the state attempts to leverage over them by enforcing property titles as a way of trying to manipulate them to engaging in the political economy, because trying to enforce property titles in such a way to manufacture costs doesn't require someone to refer to anything outside of resources they already have or could achieve by associating with somebody outside of the context of the political economy, which is something that people are incentivized to do in the relationship that they have with the state because of a phenomenon in psychology known as reactance. Now, reactance is essentially just if someone perceives like in their own perception, they think of themselves as though they're losing autonomy, it triggers a fight or flight response. So, if people are economically self sufficient, then the state imposing property titles on their economic model always looks controversial. So the state can't create propaganda models anymore to try and mask its role in the environment because people are trying to organize around it constantly if they're self sufficient as an antagonistic force against them.
Basically,
So, it. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to try to summarize it as if everybody operated within Pepens, the only way that the state could operate in response to them is purely as an antagonist. And there's no way that they're going to be able to try to reframe it in such a way that would make themselves look like anything except that.
Because people think of it as an antagonist as a result of the pressures that it introduces to them attempting to sustain themselves, which isn't an ideological construct. It's based on their ability to use their resources in practice.
I remember several years ago this particularly big story about some police district that was just pouring bleach on the food of homeless people. Imagine
Yeah, I remember that.
imagine that, but on the scale of them doing that to literally everything that you do. Not just like pouring bleach in your food, but pouring bleach down the into the gas tank of your car, uh, burning down your house, all sorts of stuff like that. Can't think of very many examples off the top of my head, but point is that they do everything and anything they can to make living your life a living hell. And it's very clear that it's them doing it. What other relationship could you possibly have with such a group other than just like something that's purely antagonistic? And would you perceive them as anything except an antagonist? That's
But the result,
sorry.
I was just going to say, because I didn't realize that you were done, that you weren't done, that basically the conclusion of getting yourself set up in a pen, it'll create two important changes to norms in the environment. It'll create something as a frame of reference that exists that's outside and is fundamentally subversive to the function of political economies. So the state can't just say, well, that's all that exists, because people can point to others who are becoming self sufficient and look at them and say, no, there's plenty of people that are clearly living without you. But as a result of the relationship that will then create between them and the government, that will put the government into a situation where it can only make decisions which are not strategically advantageous to them. Because the only way that they can respond to people getting organized in economically self-sufficient mutual aid networks would be would be using force against them. In fact, the government basically considers that to be the point where a movement they're considering like a radical group becomes an insurgent movement, is specifically when its operation internally becomes self-sufficient. But the reason why that's the problem that creates from the perspective of the government is it makes it so in relation to the people who are self-sufficient, they can only use force against them, which puts the government into a position where it's using force openly that you can then reveal to other people as a reason to become self-sufficient. So it puts the government into a situation where it can only galvanize people and give people more of a reason not be invested in the political economy by introducing it to the environment. Now that, because of the way that it changes the norms in one's behavior, and as mentioned earlier, the change in one's practical ability to express their behavior, how that influences subtly one's own perception, and consequently what informs their narrative of reality, this causes an effect it's discussed in both the context of psychology and heavily, but more specifically from like a strategic perspective in the context of counterterrorism research, known as radicalization. Now, a lot of people, when they hear the term radicalization, they think of it as though it's a pejorative used to describe basically opinions that someone doesn't like, who thinks of themselves as though they're somehow associated with the status quo. But no, radicalization is it's like a state of mind that emerges that it's not stable. It's like someone basically experiencing derealization as a result of the norms of their environment being radically altered. And I experienced this unwittingly when I was living in Missouri over the last couple of years, which we didn't even really get into. It is strange, and I don't think that most people have a frame of reference for what it's like. But in the context of that living situation, we were just out in a rural area, and we were mostly isolated. So the result of that is coupled with using the internet consistently and being surrounded by what we were studying. Yeah, it kind of warped all of our perceptions of reality a little bit. At least everybody who was staying in Missouri. And the effect that it specifically has on your perception is it makes it very difficult to think of society existing outside of the norms of your own social group. Not in the sense that you can't conceive it, but that the narrative that you've created to contextualize trust in your social environment gets like projected onto the rest of the world. It's like I said, I don't think most people have experienced something like it. But this effect can be induced by simply the economic model that you base your sense of profit around, and a pen is specifically designed to achieve this effect in such a way where it restructures your norms around behavior that's fundamentally subversive to the state. And it's subversive to the state because it allows you to exist without property titles. Which then leads to, I guess, the second key concept that's required to understand the organization of consciousness, which is property through direct action. And that is something that is fairly straightforward. Basically, it's the replacement property norm that emerges after people are economically self-sufficient because of the fact that people can simply claim resources through homesteading without incentives being leveraged against their decisions to try to prevent them from doing that through the enforcement of property titles, which then starts to reverse the influence of the state enforcing property titles in those environments and undermines the economic model of organizations that depend on their consistent ability to be enforced, because it creates a sense of risk from an economic perspective to those organizations, and also because it creates a competing property norm to the enforcement of titles, which then creates a sense of uncertainty associated with anybody who's attempting to represent the enforcement of titles to themselves as their basis for feeling certain in their own investment. Now, the third core concept that's required to, and I almost, sorry, I almost forgot to explain in INRI. So you might be asking, just in hearing the concept of property by direct action, that is it. Your reaction to hearing that initially would, might be, so are you just saying that people should do whatever they want? Um, in a certain sense, yes, but not in a moral context. In the sense that there isn't actually an objective sense of these concepts that moral ideologies represent, and actually, we're going to probably be going into that a bit more next stream. But there's a bunch of problems that emerge in, one's own perception of their own behavior if one believes that from a moral perspective, I think most people would find kind of monstrous. But getting back to the framework of an INRI, well, how exactly would you prevent this method from essentially just being used as a way to pathologically justify using violence to take what you want from anyone that you want and destroy anyone you want for any reason? Well, it's because, keep in mind what we mentioned earlier about a post-political economic network. The sense of profit that building one and setting it up is informed by is people driven by an interpersonal sense of trust that develops in the process of constructing it. Kind of like the way that love works in relationships where that develops, although not literally comparable. Comparable in the sense that it's not an emotion, it's something that emerges in the process of performance. It's a psychological phenomenon that is conditioned by the sequence of steps taken to perform an outcome. So it's an extension of technique, but that exists for the purpose of the psychological effect that it creates in that context, and framing that as its sense of profit. Now, the framework of an INRI, well, because of the fact that you can represent what perception is as an extension of technique, which then informs the internal logic behind why people perceive actions to be profitable and therefore why they use them to externalize their desires. Well, you can use this as context to expose in a technical sense what behaviors do or don't cause traumas, or what perceptions do or don't cause traumas, in a very similar manner to in a very similar framework to the way karmic cycles are depicted in Buddhism, which I call the cycle of an Inri.
Oh, that's going to be
And
a rabbit hole to go into.
yeah,
The
well, the
intergenerational
basic
cycles of trauma that the state needs to perpetuate in order to maintain its organizational model.
Yeah, the framework of an INRI, it's another, it's not an acronym, but it's another, well, it is, sorry. But it's short for enactor, inactor, and reactor. EN, as in inactor with an EN, and then IN, as in inactor, and then reactor. And what it represents is in the context of any given expression of action from within the internal reasoning of the of the narrative that caused it to emerge. There's an internal series of steps and ways that they translated into practice that representing both the action, the context it emerged within, and the perception that created it are all required as context to represent. But if you can represent all three of those as concepts, as context, I mean, then it's possible to functionally describe whether or not a behavior counts as an act of aggression, as an extension of a discipline almost. So you can simply refer to the technical nature of your behavior, contrast that to what the implications of you carrying out that action are, and based on the nature of that interaction, you can simply prove whether or not an act of aggression was committed from a technical perspective if somebody else attempts to, highlight that happened. An act of aggression in this case being simply one, that we're understanding the concept the same way. It is when someone uses force to impose themselves upon another by taking advantage of unequal power relations.
All right, and I think we got to wrap things up here because it is getting kind of late.
And the reason why unequal power relations are important is because unequal power relations can only emerge in socially engineered environments. But the last concept, and yeah, I'll definitely be explaining more about the framework of an INRI later. But the last one that causes the organization of consciousness to be understood as context is what I've been calling the revolutionary dialect.
Now that I think deserves its own video, probably
Video,
even.
probably.
Yeah, that is a lot to get into.
But the TLDR of it, without getting too deep into how it works from a cognitive perspective, you can describe concepts strategically in relation to one another in the language that you employ in such a way where you can create a perception with your own language that makes it so there's no disconnect in the performance of your behavior from in your own narrative of reality, the articulation of your own thought process. And the effect that this has, if you're able to create all three of the conditions that cause the organization of consciousness to emerge, is it creates a psychological effect where you can refer to the word organization and people will resonate with it as though they're being referred to personally, because you are organization is an extension of your means, and every action that is an extension of the method is an example of organization.
All right.
And the concept that I call the organization of consciousness, because it's like a pluralized form of the way that Buddhists describe heightened consciousness, pluralized by using the vector of language itself.
All right. I think we can wrap things up here.
All right. But yeah, it was really nice putting out another stream. I definitely needed the exercise because I haven't really been able to talk with people much, and it shows in the way that I've been articulating myself here. But we're gonna be streaming more, and I'll probably get less sloppy as we do that.
Yeah, likewise. My thoughts are all over the place right now. It's also getting late, so that doesn't help. Anyways,
Yeah. Well, on top of that, I was thinking in real time while we were making the stream how to present some of these concepts, because they're by their nature you can't really create a framing device that would work for explaining it in all contexts. One of the reasons why it's so difficult to set up. You can only really explain it to someone that doesn't already understand it by simply pointing to external context like the function of the brain or using narrative rules to show them things.
mm-hmm. Anyways, everybody, thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time we're ready to host a stream. Don't worry, we'll be posting future content.